It began on dusty parade grounds and wooden barracks, in heat and exhaustion, in shouted orders and aching muscles, in the quiet realization that something difficult was being asked, and that quitting was not an option. Easy Company was not formed by destiny. It was formed by pressure. Young men arrived from every corner of the country carrying different accents, different pasts, different reasons for being there. Some wanted adventure, some wanted purpose, some simply followed the path placed in front of them. What they shared was uncertainty, and the knowledge that whatever lay ahead would demand more than they had ever given before. At Camp Toccoa, the mountain loomed over everything. Currahee rose steep and unforgiving, its slopes cutting into lungs and legs alike. The run up and down that mountain was more than exercise. It was a test of will. Boots slammed against dirt and stone. Breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat soaked uniforms until they clung heavy against skin. Men fell behind. Others pushed through pain they had never known before. The mountain did not care who you were. It only revealed who you would become. Training was relentless. Mistakes were punished. Weakness was exposed. Endurance was demanded. Under harsh leadership and impossible standards, Easy Company was broken down piece by piece, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Paratroopers would be dropped behind enemy lines, scattered, isolated, surrounded. There would be no clean formations, no clear lines. Survival would depend on discipline learned when everything else fell apart. They learned to jump from aircraft into darkness, to trust silk canopies and cold air, to land hard and move fast, to fight with whatever men happened to be nearby. They learned to rely on each other. By the time they crossed the ocean, Easy Company was no longer a group of strangers. It was a shared rhythm, boots moving in step, rifles handled instinctively, silence understood without words. They joked to hide nerves. They argued. They bonded. And beneath it all, they waited. The night before Normandy felt longer than any night before it. Engines droned inside crowded aircraft. Parachutes pressed tight against backs. Red lights glowed faintly in metal fuselages vibrating with tension. Some men prayed. Some stared at nothing. Some thought of home in flashes they tried not to hold too long. When the light turned green, the world exploded. They jumped into chaos, into flak-filled skies, into tracer fire, into darkness torn apart by explosions. Men were scattered across fields and hedgerows, landing miles from where they were supposed to be. Equipment was lost. Units dissolved. Plans vanished. And still, Easy Company fought. Small groups found each other in the dark. Orders were replaced by instinct. They moved toward gunfire, toward objectives half-remembered, toward the sound of battle that needed to be stopped. At places like Breakcore Manor, they did what paratroopers were trained to do: strike fast, adapt faster, and disappear before the enemy could recover. Normandy was only the beginning. Easy Company fought through hedgerows where visibility shrank to arm's length, and every corner hid danger. They advanced through towns reduced to rubble. They marched under rain that never seemed to stop. They crossed rivers under fire. They watched friends fall and kept moving, because stopping meant failure. In Holland, they dropped again, this time into daylight. Fields stretched wide and exposed beneath open skies. The war moved quickly, then stalled. Bridges became prizes. Roads became lifelines. Easy Company fought not just the enemy, but frustration, confusion, and the growing weight of loss. Then came winter. The Ardennes was cold beyond imagination. Snow swallowed foxholes. Trees cracked under artillery fire. Breath froze in the air. Easy Company held the line outside Bastogne with little ammunition, little food, and no relief in sight. They stood in frozen forests where the ground was too hard to dig, and the night seemed endless. They endured because they had learned how, not because they were fearless, but because fear had become familiar. As the war pushed into Germany, Easy Company moved through landscapes already collapsing. Towns surrendered or burned. Civilians fled. The enemy grew more desperate. At Berchtesgaden, they reached places once thought unreachable. At the end, they entered camps that revealed horrors no training could prepare them for, moments that stripped victory of celebration and replaced it with silence. By the time the war ended, Easy Company was no longer whole. Some men were gone, others were changed forever. All carried memories that followed them home. Their story is not one of perfection. It is a story of mistakes and growth, of leadership earned and lost, of ordinary people shaped by extraordinary pressure. It is a story about how bonds are forged, not in speeches, but in shared suffering, how trust is built, not by words but by action, how history is moved, not by grand plans alone, but by small groups doing their job when it matters most. Tonight, we return to that journey, to the mountain that broke them down, to the skies that scattered them, to the fields, forests, towns, and frozen ground where they fought, to the moments between battles where exhaustion and brotherhood lived side by side. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you something personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has quietly settled around you? Is it late and still, or does the night feel unfinished? If these stories of endurance, brotherhood, and history help you slow down, reflect, or feel connected to something larger than the day behind you, consider subscribing and keep these journeys with you whenever you need them. June 20th, 1942, Camp Toccoa, Georgia. 140 men stand in chaotic lines under a brutal southern sun, most barely old enough to vote, their civilian clothes already soaked through with sweat. They don't know each other's names yet. They don't know that fewer than half will survive what's coming. They don't even know why they volunteered to jump out of airplanes into enemy fire, except that it pays $50 extra each month, a fortune for men who grew up with nothing during the Depression. This is Easy Company's first formation, and it looks nothing like the legend it will become. No band of brothers here, just strangers gambling their lives on paratrooper wings, and the desperate hope that this war might offer something their peacetime lives never could. The men gathering at Toccoa came from everywhere and nowhere. Dick Winters worked his family's farm in rural Pennsylvania, listening to radio reports of Pearl Harbor while milking cows in the pre-dawn darkness. Bill Guarneri stood on San Francisco docks on December 8, 1941, the day after the attack, reading recruitment posters with clenched fists and making his decision before the ink dried on the declaration of war. Across 32 different states, young men heard the news and felt the same pull, some toward revenge, some toward adventure, some simply toward a paycheck that might lift their families out of poverty. The average age was 21.7 years. Only 15% had completed high school. Most came from working-class backgrounds where manual labor was the only future they'd ever known. The Army didn't want scholars or athletes. They wanted men desperate enough to volunteer for the most dangerous job in the military. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment activated officially on July 20th, 1942, and Camp Toccoa became a proving ground for a new kind of soldier. Airborne warfare was experimental, controversial, and terrifying. Critics in the War Department called it suicide with extra steps. Paratroopers would drop behind enemy lines with no support, no resupply, and no way out except through the enemy. The casualty projections were catastrophic. Some estimates predicted 70% losses in the first wave, but the extra $50 monthly pay was worth $900 in today's money, and for men who had grown up hungry during the Depression, that was enough to sign their names and report to Georgia. They came expecting adventure. They got something else entirely. Camp Toccoa sat in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, dominated by Mount Currahee, a Cherokee word meaning stands alone. The mountain rose 1,735 feet above the red Georgia clay, 3 miles of brutal elevation gain that would become Easy Company's identity. But before they saw Currahee, before they learned what airborne meant, they met the man who would forge them through suffering, First Lieutenant Herbert Sobel. He arrived at Toccoa with a reputation for excellence in training and a personality that inspired immediate, visceral dislike. Sobel was demanding, petty, and obsessed with regulations to the point of absurdity. He wrote men up for infractions that didn't exist. He canceled weekend passes for microscopic flaws in equipment inspections. He seemed to take personal pleasure in making soldiers miserable. What the men didn't understand yet, what they wouldn't understand for years, was that Sobel's cruelty had a purpose. Paratroopers couldn't be normal infantry. They'd jump into darkness, land scattered and alone, and have to fight immediately without officers, without orders, without support. They needed to be harder than steel, mentally unbreakable, capable of functioning through exhaustion, terror, and chaos. Sobel's method was simple. Create that chaos in training, make every day harder than combat could possibly be, push men beyond what they thought they could endure, then push further. If they broke at Toccoa, they'd never jump over Normandy. If they quit during training, they wouldn't die in a French field at age 19. Sobel's mathematics were brutal but accurate. Of the 140 men who started training, only 81 would make it to jump school. The 42% washout rate was the highest in the 506th Regiment. The volunteers didn't see the logic. They just saw a tyrant. Sobel ran them up Currahee twice daily, 3 miles up, 3 miles down, in full combat gear under the Georgia sun. 3 miles up, 3 miles down became their mantra, gasped between burning lungs and screaming muscles. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. They vomited on the trail. They cried in their barracks at night, too exhausted to feel shame. The physical standards were inhuman. Run 5 miles in 40 minutes carrying full gear, complete 100 push-ups without stopping, march until your feet bled through your boots. Sobel watched them suffer with cold eyes, looking for weakness, culling anyone who couldn't meet his standards. The men began to hate him with a purity they'd never felt toward another human being. But something unexpected happened in that crucible of shared misery. The strangers became brothers. When one man struggled up Currahee, another grabbed his rifle to lighten the load. When Sobel targeted someone for harassment, the others closed ranks in silent solidarity. They couldn't fight back against their tormentor, so they fought for each other. Bill Guarnere, the tough Philadelphia kid, started looking out for the younger soldiers. Carwood Lipton, quiet and steady, became the man others turned to when things felt impossible. Dick Winters, reserved and religious, began demonstrating a different kind of leadership, leading by example rather than intimidation, earning respect rather than demanding it. The contrast between Winters and Sobel couldn't have been sharper, and the men noticed. They followed Sobel because they had to. They'd follow Winters because they wanted to. By November 1942, something resembling a military unit had emerged from the chaos. The survivors were lean, hard, and capable of extraordinary physical feats. They could run for miles without breaking stride, march through the night carrying 80 pounds of equipment, and function on 2 hours of sleep. But Sobel had one final test planned, a 118-mile forced march from Toccoa to Atlanta in December cold. It was the culmination of everything they'd endured, a final proving ground before jump school. Men dropped from exhaustion every few miles. Their feet swelled until they couldn't fit in their boots. The cold bit through their uniforms like knives, but they finished. 81 men completed the march, and when they arrived in Atlanta, they knew they'd survived something most soldiers never faced. They'd earned their right to jump. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly understand in November 1942, was that Sobel's torture had saved their lives. The men who washed out went to regular infantry units. Many died in frontal assaults against fortified positions, thrown into meat grinders with minimal training. The men who survived Toccoa were different. They could march all night and fight all day. They could function when exhausted, think when terrified, and improvise when plans collapsed. Sobel had brutalized them into becoming exactly what paratroopers needed to be, survivors. But there was a problem that would nearly destroy Easy Company before it ever saw combat. Sobel was an excellent trainer and a terrible tactical commander. He got lost on night exercises. He made basic navigational errors. He couldn't read terrain or make decisions under pressure. The men realized what would happen if Sobel led them into combat, and they knew they had to act. The tension building at Toccoa would explode months later in a confrontation that would define Easy Company's character more than any battle. But in those first months, watching strangers transform into soldiers, the pattern was already set. This company would be defined not by blind obedience, but by a deeper loyalty to each other, to competence, to the idea that leadership had to be earned rather than merely worn on collar insignia. They were learning that survival meant thinking, questioning, and trusting the men beside you more than the rank structure above you. Herbert Sobel had forged them into warriors, but he had also planted the seeds of the mutiny that would nearly tear Easy Company apart before D-Day. The lottery of war had brought these men together randomly. What happened next would prove whether random chance could forge a unit capable of changing history, or whether the bonds formed in suffering would shatter under the weight of incompetent command. August 19th, 1942. The base of Mount Currahee, 6 o'clock in the morning. The temperature already climbs past 80 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity thick, enough to choke on, and First Lieutenant Herbert Sobel stands watching 140 men prepare for their first combat gear run up the mountain. 3 miles of elevation gain, 1,735 feet of Georgia red clay, roots and rocks, full pack, rifle, helmet, the works, probably 70 pounds per man. Sobel's face shows nothing, but his stopwatch is already running. He's not interested in who finishes. He's interested in who quits. This is Currahee, the mountain that stands alone, and after today it will own these men completely. Some will master it, some will break against it. Either way, every man who survives this training will remember this mountain for the rest of his life. Dick Winters hits the trail at a sustainable pace, controlling his breathing, finding his rhythm. He grew up on a farm, knows how to work all day without burning out, understands that this is a marathon disguised as a sprint. Behind him, younger soldiers charge ahead with the enthusiasm of men who don't yet understand what 3 miles of elevation actually means to the human body. Winters watches them go, says nothing, keeps a steady pace. Halfway up, he starts passing the sprinters. They're bent over, gasping, faces purple with exertion. Some are vomiting on the trail. Others have simply stopped, standing with hands on knees, trying to remember how to breathe. Winters keeps moving, one foot in front of the other, using technique instead of just effort. This is his first lesson in a principle that will define his leadership. Conserve energy, think strategically, and never mistake activity for effectiveness. Sobel's training philosophy becomes clearer with each passing week. He's not just building strong soldiers, he's hunting for weakness and eliminating it without mercy. A man shows up to formation with a microscopic smudge on his rifle, entire weekend pass revoked for the platoon. Someone's footlocker has items arranged in the wrong order, extra duty for everyone in the barracks. The punishments are collective and seemingly random, designed to create pressure from every direction. Sobel wants to see who breaks, who complains, who turns on their fellow soldiers when things get hard. The washout rate climbs steadily. Men who looked fit and motivated in July are gone by September, sent to regular infantry units with pink slips noting their failure to meet airborne standards. Easy Company is bleeding volunteers, and Sobel watches without apparent concern. But there's a method emerging in the madness, visible to the men who pay attention. Sobel's impossible standards are creating something unexpected, unity through shared suffering. When he punishes everyone for one man's mistake, it teaches collective responsibility. When he cancels weekend passes for infractions nobody committed, it reveals his pettiness and pushes the men to rely on each other rather than the command structure. Bill Guarnere, the tough kid from Philadelphia who joined, the day after Pearl Harbor, becomes a barracks leader by sheer force of personality. Carwood Lipton, quiet and thoughtful, starts helping struggling soldiers prep their gear for inspections. The men are learning to function as a unit not because Sobel commands it, but because it's the only way to survive his tyranny. The infamous weekend pass incident in November crystallizes everything toxic about Sobel's command. Easy Company has been training for 4 months straight, running Currahee twice daily, drilling until muscle memory replaces conscious thought. The men are exhausted, homesick, desperate for 48 hours away from Toccoa. Passes are approved for the entire company, a rare reward for meeting Sobel's standards. Then, hours before the trucks leave for Atlanta, Sobel cancels everything. His stated reason? A single rifle in the company has a speck of dust in the barrel. The real reason? He can, and he wants the men to know he can. The barracks that night fills with a hatred so thick it's almost physical. Men talk in whispers about what they'd like to do to Sobel. Nobody acts on it, but the resentment burns deeper. Sobel makes his tactical incompetence impossible to ignore during a night training exercise in late September. He's supposed to lead Easy Company on a navigation exercise through the Georgia woods, following map coordinates to designated objectives. It's basic leadership training. Any competent officer should manage it easily. Sobel gets them lost within an hour. He misreads the terrain, confuses landmarks, and makes navigation decisions that contradict the obvious evidence of the landscape around them. The enlisted men, watching from their ranks, realize their commanding officer can't read a map. Dick Winters, serving as executive officer, quietly suggests corrections. Sobel ignores him, insisting on his own navigation. They wander through the woods for 6 hours, missing every objective, finishing the exercise in complete failure. The men emerge exhausted and angry, and for the first time, they're not angry at the difficulty of training. They're angry at Sobel's incompetence. The contrast between Sobel's administrative excellence and tactical failure creates a cognitive dissonance that will eventually explode. His training methods work. The men are becoming extraordinarily capable soldiers. The physical conditioning is producing results that seem almost superhuman. Men who could barely run a mile in July are now covering 5 miles in 40 minutes with full combat gear. They can march all night, dig foxholes in frozen ground, and function on 2 hours of sleep. Sobel's efficiency rating from higher command reads excellent for training preparation, but there's a second line on that efficiency report that the enlisted men don't see yet. Poor for tactical command. The Army knows Sobel is a liability in combat. The question is whether they'll do anything about it before he gets men killed. Winter arrives in Georgia, and Sobel plans his final test, a 118-mile forced march from Toccoa to Atlanta. It's December, cold for Georgia, and the men will march in formation carrying full combat loads. No trucks, no breaks longer than 10 minutes. Just 118 miles of asphalt and frozen ground, testing everything they have learned about endurance and collective willpower. The march becomes legendary in the 506th Regiment. Men's feet swell until they burst through their boots. Blood soaks through socks. Every step is agony after the first 30 miles, torture after 60, and something beyond pain after 90. But they don't stop. When one man falters, 2 others grab his gear and keep him moving. When someone collapses, the medics revive him, and the company slows its pace until he can rejoin formation. They reach Atlanta after 3 days of marching, and something has changed. The 140 volunteers who started training are now 81 hardened soldiers. The washouts are gone, sent to regular infantry, destined for different units, different battles, different fates. The survivors have been forged into something harder than they were, tougher than they believed possible. They've learned they can endure things that would break normal men. They've discovered reserves of strength they didn't know existed. And they've learned to function as a collective organism, each man supporting the others, the unit becoming more important than any individual. Sobel's methods worked, but his time is running out. What the men don't know yet, what they can't possibly understand in December 1942, is that Sobel has made himself obsolete. He was designed to create warriors through suffering, and he succeeded. But warriors need leaders they trust, commanders they believe in, officers they'd follow into hell because they know those officers would lead them back out. Sobel is not that leader. Dick Winters is becoming that leader, quietly, without seeking it, simply by demonstrating a different model. Competence over cruelty, respect over fear, leadership by example rather than by intimidation. The men see it. The other officers see it. Eventually, Sobel will see it too. And when he does, his insecurity will trigger a confrontation that forces the Army to choose between protocol and effectiveness. The mountain called Currahee forged Easy Company into something extraordinary. The mutiny brewing beneath the surface will test whether that forge-created steel strong enough to withstand fracturing from within. March 17, 1943, Camp Toccoa, North Carolina. Evening. First Lieutenant Herbert Sobel stares at a dirty latrine and sees an opportunity to destroy Dick Winters. The bathroom infraction is trivial, a minor oversight in cleanliness standards that would normally merit a verbal correction. But Sobel doesn't see a latrine. He sees his executive officer showing signs of independent leadership, earning loyalty that should belong to the commanding officer, becoming the man soldiers naturally follow. Sobel has felt it for months, the subtle shift in barracks dynamics, the way men turn to Winters for guidance even when Sobel is present. So he writes Winters up for a court-martial offense, manufacturing charges that could end his career. Sobel thinks he's eliminating a rival. He's actually lighting a fuse that will detonate his own command. The charges against Winters are technically valid but spiritually absurd. Sobel claims Winters failed to properly inspect and secure a latrine area, framing it as dereliction of duty. In reality, it's a power play, an attempt to humiliate the one officer in Easy Company who has the men's genuine respect. Winters recognizes the game immediately. He spent 8 months watching Sobel turn pettiness into an art form, but this is different. This isn't harassment, it's elimination. Sobel wants him gone, transferred out, removed as a potential threat. Winters could fight the charges, demand a hearing, defend himself through official channels. Instead, he accepts the court-martial and prepares to let the process play out. He's betting that higher command will see through Sobel's transparent vendetta. It's a risky bet, but Winters isn't the only one who sees what's happening. The non-commissioned officers of Easy Company, the sergeants who form the backbone of any military unit, have been watching Sobel for months. Bill Guarnere, the tough Philadelphia street fighter, Carwood Lipton, the quiet North Carolinian who became Easy's moral center. These men, and a dozen others, have endured Sobel's training, survived his arbitrary cruelty, and emerged as hardened combat leaders. They've also watched him get lost on every field exercise, make basic tactical errors, and demonstrate the kind of incompetence that gets soldiers killed. The Winters court-martial crystallizes a question they've been asking privately. Would we follow Herbert Sobel into combat? The answer is unanimous. No, absolutely not. They'd rather face court-martial themselves. Late March, 1943, a barracks room after midnight, Easy Company's senior NCOs gather in violation of about 6 different regulations. What they're planning is mutiny. There's no other word for it. They draft a letter stating they will not serve in combat under First Lieutenant Herbert Sobel's command. It's carefully worded but unambiguous. They respect the training he provided, acknowledge his role in preparing them, but refuse to follow him into battle. They know exactly what they're risking. Refusing to serve under an assigned officer in wartime is a court-martial offense, potentially punishable by execution. They sign it anyway. Bill Guarnere signs. Carwood Lipton signs. One by one, the NCOs who survived Currahee commit their names to paper, betting their careers and possibly their lives that Colonel Robert Sink will value their judgment over. Military protocol. The letter reaches Colonel Sink's desk, and he faces an impossible choice. Protocol demands he court-martial everyone who signed, make an example, crush the mutiny, restore order through discipline. But Sink is a combat veteran, not a bureaucrat. He understands something the regulations don't acknowledge. A commander who has lost his men's trust is worthless in battle, regardless of what his rank insignia says. Sink reads between the lines. The NCOs aren't questioning authority. They're trying to save lives. They're telling him, in the most direct way possible, that Herbert Sobel will get them killed. Sink orders an investigation, quietly interviewing officers and enlisted men, building a picture of Easy Company's toxic command climate. What he discovers confirms the mutineers' assessment. Sobel is an excellent trainer and a terrible tactical leader. April 1943. Colonel Sink makes his decision with surgical precision. He doesn't court-martial the mutineers. That would decimate Easy Company's leadership and validate Sobel's paranoid power plays. He doesn't publicly rebuke Sobel. That would humiliate an officer who, despite his flaws, served the Army faithfully. Instead, Sink transfers Sobel to a jump school instructor position, removes him from combat command, and makes it look like a promotion. Sobel leaves Easy Company believing he's won, sent to an important training role, away from soldiers who never appreciated his genius. The NCOs return to duty without punishment, their gamble vindicated. And the Army assigns a new commanding officer to Easy Company, First Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, West Point graduate, well-regarded, and crucially, someone the men don't automatically hate. Meehan's arrival changes everything. He's competent without being cruel, demands excellence without the pettiness, and actually knows how to read a map and execute tactics. Dick Winters becomes his executive officer. The court-martial quietly dropped. The NCOs who mutinied are restored to full authority, their judgment proven sound. Easy Company finally has leadership structure that makes sense. A commanding officer who can fight, and an executive officer the men would follow anywhere. The toxic climate evaporates. Men start training with purpose rather than resentment. The transformation is so dramatic that soldiers from other companies notice. Easy Company, once the most miserable unit in the 506th Regiment, becomes one of the most confident. But there's a historical irony playing out that nobody can see in April 1943. Herbert Sobel will serve through the entire war in training roles, preparing thousands of paratroopers but never commanding in combat. He'll retire from the Army, live into old age, and die without ever knowing whether he could have led men in battle. The soldiers he trained, the men who mutinied against him, will jump into Normandy on D-Day and fight through Europe's most brutal campaigns. Some will die in combat, others will live to become the most celebrated paratroopers in American history. And in their memoirs and interviews, almost every one of them will say the same thing. Herbert Sobel's training saved our lives, even though we couldn't follow him into battle. The contradiction will never be resolved. Sobel created Easy Company, but couldn't command it. The mutiny saved the unit, but destroyed the man who forged it. What the men don't realize in the spring of 1943 is that Sobel's removal creates a false sense of security. They've solved the leadership problem, yes, but they have also never experienced combat. They think competent officers and solid training equal survival. They haven't learned yet that war doesn't care about competence. Lieutenant Meehan is everything Sobel wasn't. Tactically sound, respected, capable. The men trust him completely. They believe that with Meehan leading and Winters as executive officer, Easy Company can handle anything the Germans throw at them. They're about to learn that the best prepared units still bleed, that even the most competent leaders die, and that combat is chaos that cannot be trained for, only endured. The mutiny saved Easy Company from incompetent leadership, but it also established a principle that will define them. They would question, resist, and if necessary, rebel against authority that threatened their survival. They weren't blindly obedient. They were thoughtfully loyal to each other, to competence, to the mission, but never to rank alone. That independence would serve them brilliantly in combat, when scattered drops and chaotic battles required initiative over obedience. But it would also create tension with the broader army structure, which valued compliance and protocol. Easy Company was becoming an elite unit, and elite units are always uncomfortable for the institutions that create them. They'd proven they could survive Currahee and overthrow bad leadership. Now they had to prove they could survive combat. D-Day was 13 months away. June 5th, 1944. RAF Upottery Airfield, England. 10:30 in the evening. Easy Company sits on the tarmac beside C-47 Dakota transports, faces blackened with burnt cork, bodies weighted down with equipment no human should carry into combat. 70 to 100 pounds per man, rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, medical supplies, explosives, mortar rounds. They look like pack animals dressed as soldiers. The planes wait with engines silent, and the men wait with them, suspended in the terrible hours before an invasion they've known was coming for months. Some write final letters home, pen scratching paper in the fading light. Others check and recheck equipment, finding comfort in ritual. A few sleep, the unconsciousness of men who've learned to rest whenever possible. Most just sit and think about mortality while the English June evening slowly darkens toward the midnight. Jump. The winter and spring of 1944 transformed Easy Company from American soldiers into temporary English citizens. They were billeted in Aldbourne, a small village in the Wiltshire countryside, where locals opened their homes to young paratroopers who seemed impossibly exotic and impossibly doomed. Dick Winters stayed with a family who treated him like a son. Bill Guarnere found a pub that would extend him credit when the poker games went badly. The men attended village dances, dated English girls, and tried not to think too hard about the invasion everyone knew was coming. Aldbourne became a sanctuary, a brief taste of normal life before the storm. The villagers knew most of these boys wouldn't come back. The soldiers knew it too. Nobody said it out loud. Training intensified through the spring, with a specificity that revealed the invasion's imminence. Easy Company practiced beach assault scenarios, studied aerial photographs of Norman coastline, and rehearsed until every man could recite his D-Day objectives in his sleep. Their mission: drop behind Utah Beach, advance inland, and neutralize German artillery positions that could slaughter troops landing on the beaches. Specific targets were identified: Brecourt Manor, coastal batteries, communication posts. The briefings showed topographical maps, enemy positions, expected resistance levels. The intelligence officers used words like probable and estimated when discussing German strength, which meant they were guessing. The casualty projections were delivered matter-of-factly. Expect 70% losses in the first wave of paratroopers. 7 out of 10 wouldn't survive the first 48 hours. May turned to June, and the waiting became physically painful. Soldiers were confined to sealed military camps, cut off from civilians, given increasingly detailed information about Operation Overlord. They learned they'd be jumping at 12:30 in the morning on June 6th, the first Americans over Normandy, hours before the beach landings began. They memorized recognition codes, studied maps until the Norman countryside felt familiar, and absorbed the weight of what was coming. This wasn't a training exercise. This was the invasion Hitler's Atlantic Wall was built to prevent, the assault that would either open a second front in Europe or turn the English Channel red with Allied blood. Easy Company's small role in this massive operation felt simultaneously crucial and insignificant. June 4th, 1944. D-Day is scheduled for dawn on the 5th, and Easy Company loads into aircraft, faces painted, equipment checked, ready to jump. Then the word comes down: postponement. Weather over the channel is deteriorating, making the airborne drop and beach landings too risky. Stand down. 24 hours delay. The men unload from the planes, wash the camouflage off their faces, and try to sleep while knowing tomorrow they'll do this again. Except tomorrow there won't. Be a postponement. Tomorrow is real. That extra day of waiting is psychological torture. Soldiers who'd made peace with their mortality have to do it again. Letters already written have to be reconsidered, revised, or left as they are. The fear they'd conquered resurfaces stronger. June 5th arrives with English weather. Overcast, windy, but acceptable enough for General Eisenhower to give the order. This is it. Easy Company receives final briefings in the afternoon. Lieutenant Meehan, their commanding officer, goes over the drop zone locations one more time. Dick Winters, executive officer, ensures every man understands his role. The jump will happen in darkness, scattered across Norman fields, with German flak and small arms fire trying to kill them before they even land. Assembly will be chaotic. Use the cricket clickers to identify friendlies in the dark. Avoid speaking unless necessary. Move toward objectives as quickly as possible. They're told to expect to land isolated, surrounded, and hunted. Find other Easy Company men. Complete the mission. Survive if possible. Late afternoon, the men perform rituals that feel like religious ceremonies. They check each other's parachutes, double-checking the static lines that will deploy the chutes when they jump. They distribute equipment: who carries the mortars, who has extra ammunition, who's responsible for demolition charges. Dog tags are checked, positioned correctly so they can identify bodies. Some men shave, wanting to die clean if they die today. Others write final additions to letters, brief postscripts acknowledging they're about to do the thing they've trained for since Toccoa. The chaplain offers services. Some attend. Others find their faith elsewhere. As evening approaches, the C-47s are assigned their sticks, 18 men per plane, Easy Company divided across 8 aircraft. Lieutenant Meehan will fly in Chalk No. 66, leading Easy Company into Normandy. Dick Winters boards a different plane, standard practice to ensure both the CO and XO don't die in the same aircraft loss. The stick assignments feel random but carry enormous consequences. Which plane you board will determine whether you land on target or miles away, whether you survive the drop or burn in a crashed aircraft, whether you fight with your unit or scramble alone through hostile territory. The men board their assigned planes and wait. 11:30 at night, and the engines roar to life. The sound is overwhelming, visceral, the mechanical scream of aircraft preparing for war. Soldiers wedged into uncomfortable seats feel the vibration through their boots, their bones, their teeth. This is real now. No more postponements, no more training. The planes taxi toward runways, and through the open doors, soldiers can see other aircraft stretching into the darkness. Hundreds of planes, thousands of paratroopers, the largest airborne operation in history. Easy Company is one small piece of this vast machine. 140 men among 13,000 paratroopers jumping into Normandy tonight. They feel simultaneously insignificant and essential. Midnight passes. The planes cross the English Channel, and soldiers try not to vomit from turbulence and fear. Some pray, some sleep somehow. Others sit in silence, each man alone with his thoughts, even while pressed shoulder to shoulder with his brothers. They have trained for 2 years for this moment. They have survived Currahee, endured Sobel, mutinied against incompetence, and forged themselves into the best unit in the 506th Regiment. They trust their training, trust their leaders, trust each other. What they don't know, what they can't possibly know until the jumpmaster gives the order and they leap into the darkness, is that everything they've prepared for is about to dissolve into chaos. Their commanding officer will die before reaching the ground. Their drop will scatter them miles off target, and the 70% casualty estimate will prove horrifyingly accurate. But that knowledge awaits them on the other side of midnight, in the darkness over Normandy, where history and tragedy converge. June 6, 1944. 12:15 in the morning, 1,500 feet above Normandy. The sky explodes. German anti-aircraft fire tears through the darkness like deadly fireworks. Tracer rounds drawing luminous lines between earth and sky, and the C-47 transports scatter like panicked birds. Inside Lieutenant Meehan's aircraft, Chalk 66, 18 men brace against the violent evasive maneuvers as the pilot tries to dodge flak. They can hear shrapnel punching through the fuselage, feel the plane shuddering under impact, and smell the acrid smoke of burning metal. The jumpmaster screams for them to exit, but before the order finishes, the plane lurches violently to one side. Something critical is hit. Chalk 66 is going down, and everyone aboard knows it. This is how Easy Company's D-Day begins, not with a heroic jump, but with their commanding officer falling from the sky in a burning aircraft, dying before the invasion even starts. Dick Winters lands hard in a Norman field, his parachute collapsing around him, and lies still for a moment listening to the sounds of war. Gunfire in multiple directions, explosions, aircraft engines screaming overhead, German voices shouting somewhere close. He's alone, disoriented, completely uncertain of his location relative to the drop zone. This is the nightmare scenario they trained for but couldn't fully prepare for. A night combat jump into contested territory, with zero visibility and complete tactical confusion. Winters cuts himself free from the parachute harness, pulls his weapon, and tries to remember the recognition signal. Cricket clicker. Click-clack for challenge. Click-clack-click for response. He clicks twice into the darkness and waits. Nothing. He's utterly alone in enemy territory. The German anti-aircraft defense exceeded every Allied prediction. Intelligence estimated moderate flak resistance. What the paratroopers encountered was a coordinated wall of fire, heavy machine guns, and 88mm cannons throwing up a curtain of explosive death. Pilots scattered to avoid the worst of it, which meant paratroopers jumped from the wrong locations, the wrong altitudes, the wrong speeds. Instead of concentrated drops that would allow companies to assemble quickly, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions scattered across 50 square miles of Norman countryside. Easy Company's drop was catastrophic even by these standards. Men landed miles from the designated drop zone. Equipment bundles, containing machine guns, mortars, and heavy weapons, fell into flooded areas and were lost. Of Easy Company's 140 men, only 38 found each other in the first hours after landing. Lieutenant Meehan's plane never had a chance. Witnesses from other aircraft reported seeing Chalk 66 take multiple hits, engines smoking, losing altitude rapidly. The plane disappeared toward the English Channel, presumably attempting an emergency landing on water. It crashed into the sea somewhere between England and France, sinking quickly in cold water with all hands aboard. Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, 18 Easy Company soldiers, all killed before they could contribute to the invasion. Their bodies wouldn't be recovered for years. 4 were finally found in 1948 during channel cleanup operations. The others were never recovered, listed eternally as lost at sea. Easy Company's command structure disintegrated before the battle began. Dick Winters clicks his cricket into the darkness for the 7th time and finally receives a response. Click, clack, click. He moves toward the sound, rifle ready, and finds Private First Class Popeye Wynne. 2 men. Then they find another. And another. Slowly, moving through hedgerows and across open fields, avoiding German patrols, Easy Company soldiers coalesce into small groups. Winters emerges as the ranking officer present in his group, not because anyone appointed him, but because soldiers gravitate toward competence and Winters radiates tactical intelligence even in chaos. By 3:30 in the morning, he's collected 11 men. It's not a company, it's barely a squad, but it's enough to start executing the mission. The reality of their situation becomes clearer as darkness gives way to pre-dawn light. They're approximately 2 miles south of the intended drop zone. Easy Company is scattered across the Norman countryside in fragments. Some groups have 5 men, some have 2, some soldiers are still alone and searching. The equipment they need for their assigned objectives is lost or miles away. Communication with higher command is non-existent. The radios were in equipment bundles that landed in swamps. And Lieutenant Meehan is missing, presumed dead, which means Dick Winters is now commanding Easy Company, despite having no official orders and no way to coordinate with the rest of the battalion. Command by circumstance, leadership through necessity. By dawn on June 6th, the invasion's scope becomes visible. From elevated positions, Winters and his small group can see the English Channel filled with ships, the largest naval armada in history, delivering 150,000 Allied troops to French beaches. They can hear the naval bombardment, feel it through the ground, watch smoke rising from German positions, getting pulverized by battleship guns. Utah Beach is maybe 3 miles north, and Allied soldiers are dying there by the hundreds, pinned down by German artillery that Easy Company was supposed to neutralize. The mission hasn't changed just because the drop scattered them. If anything, it's more urgent. German guns are killing American troops, and stopping those guns is why Easy Company jumped into Normandy. The first 6 hours of D-Day cost Easy Company 7 killed, 12 wounded, and 23 missing. The missing would gradually be accounted for. Some found other units and fought with them. Some were captured, some were killed, but their bodies not yet found. And a very few, like Lieutenant Meehan's crew, were simply gone forever. The casualty rate matched predictions almost exactly. 70% losses among the first wave. The mathematics of war proving accurate, but the men who survived those first chaotic hours discovered something crucial about themselves. They could function in chaos. The training at Toccoa, the brutal conditioning under Sobel, the endless practice jumps and tactical exercises, all of it paid off in the ability to improvise, adapt, and execute missions even when everything went wrong. Dick Winters gathers his small force and makes a decision that will define his leadership for the rest of the war. They will not wait for orders. They will not try to assemble the full company before acting. They will find a mission and complete it with whatever men they have. This is the opposite of military doctrine, which emphasizes consolidation and coordination. But Winters understands that doctrine assumes communication and unit cohesion. In the current situation, scattered, leaderless, surrounded, waiting means letting German artillery keep killing Americans on Utah Beach. Action, even with an undersized force, serves the mission better than paralysis. He leads his 11 men toward the sound of fighting, toward their original objectives, into the chaos that is Normandy on D-Day. What none of them knows yet, what they'll only learn hours later, is that their new commanding officer, the man who will lead them through the rest of the war, is already leading them. Dick Winters doesn't have orders appointing him. He has necessity, competence, and the trust of men who've watched him demonstrate leadership for 2 years. He'll learn of Meehan's death, officially sometime on June 6th, and at that moment his field command will become formal. But the reality is already in place. Easy Company belongs to Dick Winters now, forged not through assignment, but through circumstance, through his actions in the darkness when rank meant nothing and only leadership mattered. The scattered jump that should have destroyed Easy Company instead revealed who they truly were. Soldiers who could adapt, improvise, and fight, even when every advantage was stripped away. Currahee had prepared them. The mutiny had taught them to trust judgment over rank. Now Normandy was teaching them that survival meant thinking, not just obeying. The invasion was hours old, and Easy Company was already being transformed. June 6th, 1944. 8 o'clock in the morning, Normandy countryside. Dick Winters receives orders from Colonel Robert Sink that will define his military career and change Army tactical doctrine for the next 80 years. German 105mm artillery pieces are firing on Utah Beach from positions near Brecourt Manor, killing American soldiers as they struggle through surf and sand. The guns must be silenced. Winters has 13 men, not a platoon, not even a full squad. Just 13 paratroopers scraped together from the scattered D-Day drop. The Germans have an estimated 50 infantry protecting 4 heavy artillery pieces dug into fortified positions behind hedgerows. The mathematics suggest this mission is suicide. Winters looks at his men, calculates the odds, and decides to attack anyway. Sometimes mathematics don't account for training, terrain knowledge, and the advantage of men who've already survived the impossible in the last 8 hours. Winters scouts the position first, taking 3 men on a reconnaissance patrol through the Norman hedgerows that will dominate combat in this region for the next month. The hedgerows are ancient, 8-foot earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, embedded with centuries of root growth, creating natural fortifications every 100 yards. They provide perfect cover for defenders and deadly obstacles for attackers. Winters uses them brilliantly, moving through the network of fields and barriers until he can observe Brecourt Manor from concealment. What he sees confirms the nightmare: 4 German artillery pieces in prepared positions, crews working them efficiently, infantry dug into trenches providing overlapping fields of fire. A frontal assault would be slaughter. So, Winters doesn't plan a frontal assault. What happens next becomes a textbook example of fire and maneuver tactics, studied at West Point and the Army's infantry schools for decades. Winters divides his 13 men into 3 elements: a base of fire team to pin down German defenders, an assault team to attack from the flank, and a support element to provide covering fire and exploit success. It's basic small unit infantry tactics, except it's being executed by a drastically undermanned force against a superior enemy in fortified positions. The plan requires precise timing, disciplined fire control, and soldiers capable of independent action when the plan inevitably breaks down. Winters briefs his men in terse sentences. They nod understanding. No questions. They've trained for this. 9:30 in the morning, and the assault begins. Carwood Lipton positions his machine gun team to provide suppressing fire on the German trenches. The gun opens up, forcing German heads down, disrupting their defensive coordination. While the Germans focus on the machine gun threat, Winters leads Bill Guarneri, Donald Malarkey, and 3 others in a flanking maneuver through the hedgerows. They move fast and low, using terrain for concealment, closing the distance before the Germans realize they're being flanked. Winters reaches a position 30 yards from the first gun emplacement and signals the assault. They charge the trench screaming, firing as they move, closing to grenade range before the defenders can react effectively. The first gun position falls in brutal close-quarters combat. Winters kills the gun crew commander with his rifle. Guarneri throws grenades into the trench, the explosion stunning the survivors. They overrun the position, Germans surrendering or dying, and Winters immediately destroys the artillery piece's firing mechanism with thermite grenades. 1 gun down, 3 to go. But the element of surprise is gone now. The remaining German positions know they're under attack and start coordinating defensive fire. This is where the plan breaks down and soldiers have to improvise. The second gun position proves harder. Germans pour fire from multiple angles, forcing Winters' assault team to take cover in a drainage ditch. They're pinned down, the attack stalling, and men are getting hit. Private John Hall takes a round through the shoulder. Winters realizes they need to break the stalemate, or they'll get cut to pieces. He signals for covering fire, and when Lipton's machine gun opens up again, Winters leads another assault on the second gun. This time, the Germans are ready. The fighting is vicious, close-range rifle fire and grenades, men killing each other at distances measured in yards. Winters' friend Popeye Wynn goes down with leg wounds, but they take the position, destroy the second gun, and consolidate before the Germans can counterattack. Between the second and third gun positions, Winters encounters Private First Class John "Cowboy" Hall bleeding out from throat wounds. The round severed his carotid artery, and there's nothing either the medics can do except make him comfortable while he dies. Hall knows it. Winters knows it. They exchange a look that contains everything: acknowledgement, respect, the terrible understanding that this is how wars are won, through the deaths of men barely old enough to vote. Hall dies within minutes. Winters has no time to process it. The third gun is still operational, still killing Americans on Utah Beach, and the mission isn't complete until all 4 guns are silenced. The assault on the third gun benefits from reinforcements. Lieutenant Ronald Spears arrives with additional paratroopers from Dog Company, doubling Winters' effective force. The combined group overwhelms the German position through sheer momentum, suffering casualties but maintaining pressure. The Germans begin falling back toward the fourth gun, their defensive cohesion breaking. Winters presses the advantage, knowing that hesitation gives the enemy time to reorganize. They assault the 4th position with the fury of men who've already paid too high a price to stop now. The final gun falls by 12:30 in the afternoon. 4 hours of sustained combat. 4 artillery pieces destroyed. The guns that were slaughtering men on Utah Beach are silent. The butcher's bill comes due when the adrenaline fades. Easy Company suffered 4 men killed and 6 wounded out of the 13 who started the assault, a 38% casualty rate. The Germans lost an estimated 15 to 20 killed, 12 captured, and the rest scattered. But the strategic impact vastly exceeded the tactical cost. Those 4 guns were firing on Utah Beach's causeway exits, the narrow paths off the beach that channeled American troops into kill zones. By silencing them, Winters' assault prevented an estimated 150 American casualties. The mathematics of war. Trade 13 men's blood for 150 men's lives. It's a ratio that makes strategic sense and moral horror simultaneously. Dick Winters receives the Distinguished Service Cross for the Brecourt Manor Assault, the second highest valor award in the U.S. military, one step below the Medal of Honor. But the real impact is doctrinal. After the war, Army analysts study the action in detail, interview participants, and reconstruct Winters' tactics. The assault becomes the template for how small units should attack fortified positions: reconnaissance first, fire and maneuver tactics, disciplined fire control, exploitation of flanking opportunities, maintaining momentum even under casualties. Brecourt Manor gets taught at West Point. It appears in infantry training manuals. 80 years later, officers still learn Dick Winters' name in connection with textbook small unit tactics. But for the men who fought it, Brecourt Manor is remembered differently, not as a tactical triumph, but as the day they learned the real cost of war. The day Cowboy Hall bled out in a Norman field. The day they discovered that even perfect execution doesn't prevent casualties, that training and courage and brilliant tactics still leave men dead in ditches. Dick Winters will spend the rest of his life uncomfortable with the fame Brecourt brings him. He'll insist in interviews and memoirs that the credit belongs to the men who followed him into that assault, who executed the plan under fire, who paid with blood for the artillery pieces they destroyed. The Army celebrates Brecourt as a victory. The survivors remember it as the price of victory, and wonder if any tactical brilliance justifies what they saw in those hedgerows on D-Day morning. June 8, 1944. Carentan, France. Dawn. Easy Company advances into a Norman town that represents everything terrible about hedgerow warfare, compressed into a square mile of hell. Carentan sits at the junction of Utah and Omaha Beach causeways, strategically vital, which means the Germans will defend it savagely, and the Americans must take it regardless of cost. The town is burning from artillery bombardment, smoke turning morning into twilight, and German snipers occupy every window and rooftop. Easy Company has orders to clear the townhouse by house, which means close-quarters combat in conditions that favor defenders enormously. They've been in continuous combat for 48 hours since jumping on D-Day. They're exhausted, under strength, and running on adrenaline and fear. The next 4 days will cost them 30% casualties and teach them that D-Day was just the beginning. The Battle of Carentan dissolves into urban warfare chaos that makes Brecourt Manor look clean by comparison. In hedgerow assaults, you can at least see the battlefield, identify positions, maneuver around obstacles. In town fighting, every doorway is a potential ambush, every window a sniper position, every pile of rubble a machine gun nest. Easy Company advances building by building, kicking down doors, clearing rooms with grenades and rifle fire, trying not to kill French civilians cowering in basements. The Germans fight from prepared positions, falling back slowly, making the Americans pay for every block. Bill Guarnere kicks in a door and walks into a burst of machine gun fire that somehow misses. The next soldier through isn't as lucky. June 12, 1944. Carentan is theoretically secured, but the Germans launch a massive counterattack at dawn that nearly overruns Easy Company's positions. Panzers, German tanks, roll into town supported by infantry, and suddenly Easy Company is fighting desperately just to avoid being surrounded and annihilated. They're dug into hasty defensive positions with minimal anti-tank weapons, watching armor advance toward them with the terrible knowledge that rifles don't stop tanks. The situation becomes critical. Men start calculating surrender versus death, wondering which is preferable. Then, American tank destroyers arrive, rushing forward to engage the panzers, and the counterattack stalls in a mechanized brawl that saves Easy Company from destruction. The psychological wear begins showing in ways physical injuries don't. Buck Compton watches a close friend die to artillery, a direct hit that leaves nothing recognizable, just meat and fabric scattered across a crater. Compton doesn't break then. He keeps functioning, keeps leading, keeps doing his job. But something changes inside him, a crack forming in the foundation of his mental endurance. He doesn't recognize it yet. Neither do his fellow soldiers. Combat trauma doesn't announce itself. It accumulates silently, building pressure behind psychological barriers until those barriers catastrophically fail. Compton's breakdown is still months away, but Carentan plants the seeds. The Norman hedgerow terrain becomes Easy Company's universe and prison for 33 continuous days. Each hedgerow is an obstacle that must be cleared, and there are thousands of them, creating a labyrinth where visibility extends maybe 50 yards before hitting another wall of earth and vegetation. The Germans defend brilliantly, using the terrain to maximum advantage, placing machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire, mining approaches, and falling back only when positions become untenable. Easy Company attacks the same way they were taught at Toccoa, with aggression, coordination, and fire and maneuver tactics. But even perfect tactics grind slowly against a dug-in enemy in defensive terrain. The casualty count rises with mathematical inevitability. 1 man killed by sniper fire, 2 wounded by mortar fragments, 3 lost to a machine gun ambush. The numbers accumulate across days and weeks until Easy Company's roster looks nothing like the unit that jumped on D-Day. Of the 140 men who started, 52 are killed, wounded, or missing by the time Normandy operations conclude. That's a 37% casualty rate, and those are just the physical injuries. Every survivor carries psychological scars that won't manifest for years or decades. The company bleeds expertise. Veteran soldiers who survived Toccoa training and the D-Day drop are replaced by green troops fresh from the States who've never heard a shot fired in anger. The replacement soldiers create a 2-tier company structure that will persist through the rest of the war. The Toccoa originals, the men who survived Currahee and jumped on D-Day, form an informal aristocracy, bonded by shared suffering that newcomers can never fully join. The replacements are necessary, capable, often brave, but they're not brothers in the same way. They didn't earn their place through the forge of Sobel's training. They didn't scatter across Normandy in darkness and reassemble through sheer determination. The original Easy Company men accept the replacements professionally, but keep emotional distance. You don't invest fully in men who might die tomorrow. The replacements feel the separation and resent it, but they understand. They're joining a family formed in trauma, and outsiders are never fully welcomed. By late June, the daily routine becomes a grinding monotony punctuated by terror. Patrol, dig foxholes, wait for orders, assault the next hedgerow, take casualties, consolidate, repeat. Sleep becomes a luxury measured in minutes. Food is cold K-rations, eaten in ditches. Personal hygiene deteriorates to the point where everyone stinks of sweat, cordite, and fear. The men develop the 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans recognize. Eyes that see through you rather than at you, focused on something internal and terrible. They stop writing letters home because they can't explain what they're experiencing and don't want to try. The disconnect between combat reality and civilian comprehension becomes an unbridgeable gap. June 29, 1944. Easy Company receives orders for one final push before rotation out of the line. They assault a heavily defended German position, take it after brutal fighting, and hold against the inevitable counterattack. More casualties. More friends bleeding out in Norman mud. More names added to the roster of the dead. But this time, when they consolidate after the battle, they receive the news they've been desperately hoping for: relief. The battalion is pulling out of Normandy, returning to England for rest and refit. 33 continuous days in combat are ending. The survivors look at each other with expressions mixing relief, guilt, and exhaustion, so profound it's become their baseline state. July 10th, 1944. Easy Company boards trucks bound for England, leaving Normandy behind. The men are filthy, underweight, and hollow-eyed. They've lost more than a third of their number killed or wounded. They've killed an unknown number of Germans. Nobody keeps accurate count in sustained combat. They have accomplished their mission of disrupting German defenses and supporting the Allied breakout from the beaches. By any military metric, they succeeded. But success tastes like ashes when you're riding away from fields where your friends are buried. The truck convoy passes through liberated French towns where civilians cheer and wave, grateful for their freedom. Easy Company soldiers stare at them without expression, too exhausted for emotion, too traumatized to celebrate. The crossing back to England feels like traveling between worlds. They board ships at Normandy ports, cross the channel that 2 months ago they crossed going the other direction, and disembark in an England that seems impossibly clean, safe, and distant from war. The Army gives them 2 weeks of rest, actual beds, hot showers, cooked meals, no combat patrols. Some men sleep 18 hours straight, bodies reclaiming the sleep debt accumulated across 33 days of sustained combat. Others can't sleep at all, lying awake reliving firefights, hearing phantom artillery, feeling phantom blood on their hands. The physical wounds heal with time and medical care. The psychological wounds go unacknowledged, untreated, and unhealed. The term PTSD doesn't exist yet. The Army calls it combat fatigue and expects soldiers to push through it. Most do. Some break anyway. What Easy Company doesn't know during those 2 weeks of English summer rest is that Normandy was just the beginning. They've proven they can fight and survive the worst infantry combat of the war so far. The Army has noticed. Elite units don't get rewarded with safe assignments. They get sent to the most critical missions. In 2 months, Easy Company will jump into Holland for Operation Market Garden. In 6 months, they'll be surrounded at Bastogne in winter conditions that make Normandy look comfortable. The men resting in English barracks in July 1944 think they have survived the worst. They have no idea what's waiting in the frozen forests of Belgium, where Easy Company will face their ultimate test and discover that surviving Normandy only qualified them for harder trials ahead. September 17th, 1944, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Above Eindhoven, Netherlands, Easy Company jumps into the clearest, most perfect airborne drop of the war, a textbook operation that lands them exactly on target, in daylight, with minimal anti-aircraft fire. After the nightmare scattering of D-Day, this feels like redemption. Parachutes bloom across blue Dutch sky in neat formations, soldiers landing in designated drop zones, assembling quickly into cohesive units. Within 2 hours, Easy Company is organized, equipped, and advancing on objectives. This is what airborne operations are supposed to look like when planning meets execution. The men are confident, aggressive, flush with the success of Normandy, and eager to prove themselves again. They have no idea they're participating in one of the war's greatest strategic blunders, Operation Market Garden, the plan that promised to end the war by Christmas and instead extended it by 6 months. The strategic concept sounds brilliant in briefings. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposes a daring thrust through Holland into Germany's industrial heartland. Airborne forces will capture a series of bridges from Belgium to Arnhem, creating a corridor for armored divisions to race through and cross the Rhine River into Germany. If it works, the Allies bypass Germany's fortified Siegfried Line, outflank their defenses, and potentially end the war before winter. Easy Company's role is straightforward. Jump into Eindhoven, capture the town and its bridges, secure the route for British armor advancing from the south. Intelligence reports minimal German resistance. The drop zones are safe. The operation has been planned for weeks with meticulous attention to detail. What could possibly go wrong? September 18th, 1944. Easy Company liberates Eindhoven, and the Dutch reaction is euphoric. Civilians pour into the streets, waving orange flags, the color of the Dutch royal family, showering paratroopers with flowers, kisses, and gratitude so profound it's overwhelming. Women embrace soldiers weeping with joy. Old men shake hands with tears streaming down their faces. Children mobbed the Americans begging for chocolate and chewing gum. For a brief moment, Easy Company experiences what they imagined liberation would feel like. Not the grim house-to-house fighting of Carentan, but genuine welcome from people who've endured 4 years of Nazi occupation. The celebration feels earned, validating, a reward for surviving Normandy. It also creates a false sense that Market Garden is working. The problems emerge on Hell's Highway, the single narrow road running from Belgium through Eindhoven toward Arnhem that the entire Allied offensive depends on. German forces, supposedly scattered and demoralized, launch coordinated counterattacks that cut the highway in multiple places. Suddenly, the British armor can't advance. Supply convoys can't get through. The entire operations timeline, already aggressive to the point of recklessness, starts slipping. Easy Company finds itself fighting not to advance, but to keep the highway open, engaging German infantry and armor in battles that weren't supposed to happen because the intelligence said German forces in this sector were weak and disorganized. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. September 19th through 20th, 1944. Easy Company fights along Hell's Highway in confusing, fragmented engagements that lack the clear objective structure of Normandy combat. They're essentially playing defensive guard duty on a supply route, which means reacting to German attacks rather than executing planned assaults. It's frustrating, grinding work with unclear purpose. Soldiers can't see how their individual firefights contribute to the larger operation. They just know they're fighting Germans who are supposed to be retreating, but instead seem determined and well-equipped. The casualties start accumulating, not catastrophic numbers like Normandy, but steady attrition that depletes the company's strength with no obvious gain to show for it. Up north at Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division is fighting a desperate battle that will define Market Garden's failure. They dropped expecting to find minimal German resistance. Instead, they encountered 2 SS Panzer divisions refitting in the Arnhem area, elite German armor that intelligence either missed or ignored. The British paratroopers are being systematically destroyed, trying to hold the Arnhem Bridge against overwhelming force. Field Marshal Montgomery's plan required the bridge to be held for 2 days until British armor arrived. The British paratroopers hold it for 4 days before being overrun. The armor never arrives, Hell's Highway never fully opens, the Rhine crossing never happens. Easy Company soldiers hear rumors of the disaster at Arnhem, but don't grasp its full scope until after the operation ends. They're too focused on their immediate tactical situation, holding highway sections, repelling German counterattacks, trying not to die in battles that feel increasingly pointless. On September 24th, the operation's futility becomes undeniable. The British ground forces reach the Waal River but can't push beyond it. The Arnhem Bridge is lost. The Germans have sealed off the penetration. Market Garden has failed. Easy Company receives orders to withdraw across the Waal, consolidate positions, and prepare for defensive operations. The promised quick end to the war evaporates. The final butcher's bill for Market Garden is devastating. The British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem suffered 1,485 killed and 6,854 captured out of 10,600 men, a catastrophic 68% casualty rate. Easy Company lost 22 killed and wounded over 2 weeks of fighting, lighter than Normandy but still significant. But the strategic cost exceeded the tactical losses. Market Garden delayed the Allied advance by 2 months, allowed Germany time to reinforce its defenses, and guaranteed the war would continue through another winter. The operation that promised to end the war by Christmas instead ensured soldiers would be fighting through snow and ice into 1945. The Dutch civilians who celebrated liberation in September faced renewed Nazi occupation and brutal reprisals. The Germans punished Dutch areas that had welcomed the Allies, confiscating food, executing resistance members, and creating a humanitarian catastrophe that killed thousands from starvation during the winter of 1944 to 45. Easy Company soldiers remember the joy on Dutch faces when they arrived, and the knowledge that their operational failure condemned those same civilians to more suffering haunts them. Liberation incomplete is sometimes crueler than no liberation at all. It offers hope, then snatches it away. October 5th, 1944. Easy Company completes its withdrawal from the Market Garden operational area and enters a period of confusing limbo. They're not actively fighting, but they're not in reserve either. They occupy positions in defensive sectors, conduct patrols, and wait for new orders. The mood is complicated, relief at surviving another major operation mixed with frustration at the waste, the futility, the sense that they accomplished nothing worth the casualties. Market Garden taught Easy Company a lesson Normandy hadn't. Sometimes courage and competence aren't enough. Sometimes the strategy is flawed from the start, and soldiers pay for generals' miscalculations. Dick Winters processes Market Garden differently than his men. He studies what went wrong from a tactical and strategic perspective, learning lessons about overconfidence, intelligence failures, and the dangers of rigid planning that doesn't account for enemy adaptation. He recognizes that Easy Company performed well. They took their objectives, held their positions, adapted to changing circumstances. The failure was operational and strategic, not tactical. But that distinction doesn't comfort the families of the 22 casualties. It doesn't help the Dutch civilians who greeted them as liberators and then watched them retreat. Winters files the lessons away, knowing that future operations will test whether the Army learned anything from Market Garden's failure. The answer, he'll discover in 2 months, is no. The same institutional overconfidence that doomed Market Garden will send Easy Company to Bastogne with inadequate equipment and no plan for what to do if surrounded. Some lessons, apparently, are too expensive to learn. December 18th, 1944. 60 miles from Bastogne, Belgium. Night. Easy Company loads into open cattle trucks for emergency deployment to stop a German offensive nobody saw coming. The trucks have no heat, no seats, just wooden floors where 130 soldiers crouch against winter wind that cuts through summer uniforms like razors made of ice. The temperature hovers around 20 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. The men are wearing the same gear they wore in Holland: lightweight jackets, cotton trousers, no winter equipment because the Army didn't issue any. They've been in reserve, resting, expecting a quiet December. Instead, Hitler launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest 3 days ago, and now the 101st Airborne Division is racing to plug the gap before German panzers reach the Meuse River and split the Allied front in half. The 60-mile journey takes 10 hours. Men arrive at Bastogne already half frozen, and the siege hasn't even begun. Bastogne is a transportation hub. 7 roads converge on the small Belgian town, which makes it strategically vital to both sides. Whoever controls Bastogne controls movement through the Ardennes. The Germans need it to sustain their offensive. The Americans need it to prevent German breakthrough. Easy Company and the rest of the 101st Airborne arrive on December 19th and immediately establish defensive perimeter around the town. The initial intelligence briefings are optimistic. They'll hold for a few days until armored reinforcements arrive, then push the Germans back. The intelligence is, once again, catastrophically wrong. Within 48 hours, German forces complete the encirclement. The 101st Airborne is surrounded, cut off from resupply, and facing an enemy that outnumbers them 5-1. December 20th, 1944. The reality of their situation becomes undeniable. Easy Company digs foxholes in frozen ground so hard it barely yields to entrenching tools. The positions are shallow, inadequate, barely deep enough to provide protection from artillery. The men hunker down and wait for the German assault they know is coming. The temperature drops to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, then 0, then below 0. Frostbite becomes as dangerous as German bullets. Soldiers wrap their feet in whatever cloth they can find, trying to prevent trench foot. It doesn't work. Within a week, Easy Company will have 13 cases of TU. Severe frostbite and trench foot requiring evacuation, nearly as many as combat casualties. The German surrender demand arrives on December 22nd. 4 German officers approach American lines under a white flag carrying an ultimatum: surrender Bastogne or face annihilation. The message reaches Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne. His one-word response becomes legendary: nuts. The Germans, confused by American slang, require explanation. The American negotiator clarifies: it means go to hell. The Germans withdraw. The siege continues. Easy Company soldiers hear about McAuliffe's reply and laugh. The kind of laughter men produce when the alternative is screaming. They're surrounded, outgunned, freezing, and running out of ammunition. But they're not surrendering. The siege mathematics are brutal and simple. Bastogne's defenders have limited ammunition, limited medical supplies, and limited food. The Germans have unlimited artillery and no supply constraints. Every day the Americans grow weaker, while the Germans maintain strength. Artillery bombardment becomes the daily soundtrack. German shells falling around the clock, tearing apart buildings, cratering roads, killing soldiers in foxholes who thought they were safe. Easy Company learns to identify incoming rounds by sound, distinguish between artillery and mortars, calculate time between flash and impact. They become connoisseurs of death arriving from the sky. Ammunition rationing begins on December 23rd. Rifle rounds limited to 10 per man. Machine guns to short bursts only when targets are certain. Artillery to 10 shells per gun per day, barely enough for defensive fire. Easy Company soldiers conserve ammunition religiously, take careful aim, make every shot count. They also start scrounging ammunition from casualties, American and German, because official supply is exhausted and resupply is impossible. The surrounded perimeter becomes a closed ecosystem where everything gets recycled. Ammunition, rations, medical supplies, even clothing stripped from the dead. Waste is unaffordable. December 24th, 1944. Christmas Eve in frozen foxholes. The men receive 1K ration per man as their holiday meal. Canned meat, crackers, and powdered coffee that freezes before it can be consumed. No turkey dinner, no Christmas carols, just another day of artillery bombardment and freezing temperatures. Some soldiers try to find meaning in the religious significance of the date. Others just endure. The psychological toll of the siege is accumulating faster than physical casualties. Soldiers stop talking except when necessary. They develop the flat effect of extreme trauma. Emotions shut down because feeling anything is unbearable. They watch friends die and feel nothing, not because they don't care, but because their capacity for emotional response has been exhausted. December 26, 1944, 4:45 in the afternoon. The sound of tank engines approaches from the south, and for once, it's American tanks. General George Patton's Third Army has broken through the German encirclement, reaching Bastogne after a forced march that military historians still study for its speed and audacity. The siege is lifted. The perimeter is relieved. Easy Company soldiers climb from foxholes and stare at the Shermans rolling past like they're hallucinating. 8 days surrounded. 8 days of starvation, freezing, and constant bombardment. It's over, except it's not. The Germans still surround most of Bastogne. The corridor Patton opened is narrow and contested. Easy Company will remain in combat around Bastogne for another 2 weeks. The fighting continues through early January as American forces expand the corridor and push German forces back. Easy Company participates in counterattacks, patrol actions, and defensive operations that blend together into an exhausted blur. The weather remains catastrophic. Temperatures regularly hitting -20 Fahrenheit with wind chill. Men lose fingers and toes to frostbite. Others develop trench foot so severe they can't walk. The medical aid station operates from a cellar with minimal supplies, treating casualties by candlelight because there's no electricity. Wounded soldiers can't be evacuated until the siege lifts, so they lie in the cellar listening to artillery and wondering if they'll bleed out before medical help arrives. January 9th, 1945. Easy Company is finally withdrawn from the Bastogne sector after 23 consecutive days in combat. The casualty count is devastating. 18 killed, 47 wounded, and 13 severe frostbite cases requiring evacuation. The survivors have lost an average of 15 to 20 pounds from malnutrition and stress. They look like concentration camp victims, hollow-eyed, emaciated, aged 20 years and 3 weeks. The Army sends them to rear areas for rest, hot food, and medical care. Some soldiers sleep for 24 hours straight. Others can't sleep at all, too traumatized by the experience to relax even when safe. Bastogne broke something in Easy Company that Normandy and Market Garden hadn't touched. It proved that even elite soldiers have breaking points, and the frozen siege found those limits for many men. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's Ardennes offensive that Bastogne was central to stopping, ended in complete German failure. The Wehrmacht exhausted its last strategic reserves in an operation that gained nothing and lost everything, but the cost to the defenders was equally catastrophic. The 101st Airborne Division suffered 4,500 casualties defending Bastogne, nearly 40% of the division's strength. Easy Company's losses matched those proportions. The siege tested men beyond what Currahee training, D-Day chaos, and Normandy hedgerows had prepared them for. They discovered that courage has limits, endurance has breaking points, and survival sometimes comes down to luck more than skill. The frozen circle of Bastogne claimed soldiers who'd survived everything else the war threw at them. And for those who survived, the memory of those foxholes, that cold, and that helpless waiting for German artillery would haunt them for the rest of their lives. January 9th, 1945. 10 o'clock in the morning, outside Foy, Belgium. Lieutenant Norman Dyke leads Easy Company in an assault across an open, snow-covered field toward a German-held village, and within minutes it becomes horrifyingly clear that he has no idea what he's doing. The company advances in loose formation, exposed, with no covering fire and no tactical plan beyond move forward. German machine guns open up from Foy's buildings, and men start falling. Dyke freezes, not tactically repositioning, not giving orders, just standing motionless in the middle of a killing field, while his soldiers dive for whatever cover they can find. Easy Company is pinned down, taking casualties, and their commanding officer has mentally checked out at the exact moment they need leadership most. Dick Winters watches from an elevated position 400 yards away, binoculars pressed to his face, witnessing a disaster in real time. He makes a decision that violates every protocol in the Army manual. He relieves Dyke mid-battle and sends in a different officer to salvage what's becoming a massacre. Norman Dyke arrived at Easy Company after Bastogne, a Yale graduate with minimal combat experience, assigned to replace officers killed or wounded during the siege. On paper, he looks qualified. In practice, he's a catastrophe. The enlisted men spot his incompetence immediately. He doesn't understand terrain, doesn't coordinate with supporting units, doesn't inspire confidence or respect. The NCOs work around him when possible, quietly executing tactics while letting Dyke believe he's in command. But you can't work around a commanding officer during an active assault. When bullets fly, someone has to make immediate tactical decisions, and if that someone freezes, soldiers die. Foy is where Dyke's incompetence stops being a frustrating inconvenience and becomes a lethal threat. The assault on Foy should be straightforward after the lessons of Brécourt Manor and Carentan. Use supporting fire to suppress defenders. Flank the target to avoid frontal assault. Maintain momentum through aggressive maneuver. Dyke does none of this. He orders a frontal advance across open ground with no preparatory fire. When Germans shoot back, predictably, inevitably, he has no contingency plan. The company is caught in a classic ambush scenario, trapped between German machine guns and their own lack of leadership. Men press themselves into snow, trying to become smaller targets, shouting for orders that don't come. Sergeant Carwood Lipton tries to organize a response from his position, but without officer coordination, it's piecemeal and ineffective. Buck Compton, Easy Company's beloved officer who survived D-Day, Normandy, Market Garden, and Bastogne, watches two close friends get hit within 24 hours of the Foy assault. Bill Guarnere loses his leg to artillery. Joe Toye suffers similar wounds in the same barrage, shrapnel tearing through flesh and bone, both men screaming in snow turned red with blood. Compton helps load them onto jeeps for evacuation, watching his friends carried away knowing they'll never fight again. Something breaks inside him. The psychological damage that's been accumulating since Carentan, every friend killed, every soldier wounded under his command, every brutal minute of Bastogne finally exceeds his capacity to compartmentalize. Compton suffers a complete psychological breakdown. The medics diagnose it as battle fatigue. The modern term is PTSD. Whatever you call it, Buck Compton is done. He's evacuated from the front lines and never returns to Easy Company. At 10:30 in the morning, with Easy Company pinned down and casualties mounting, Dick Winters makes his unprecedented decision. He radios Captain Ronald Spears, commanding Dog Company, and orders him to take over Easy Company immediately. Spears runs toward Foy, literally runs, sprinting across the battlefield while Germans shoot at him, relieves Dyke of command mid-battle, and assumes control of the assault. What happens next becomes Easy Company legend. Spears assesses the situation in seconds, issues clear orders, coordinates suppressing fire, and leads a flanking maneuver that breaks the stalemate. He then sprints through Foy alone, reaches an isolated American unit on the far side, coordinates with them, and runs back through German positions to Easy Company. It's tactically insane. It's also exactly what the situation needs: visible, aggressive leadership that breaks the paralysis Dyke created. Spears completes the assault on Foy with the efficiency that should have characterized it from the start. Easy Company takes the village by early afternoon, with 6 killed and 14 wounded. Acceptable casualties for taking a defended position, but far higher than necessary if the assault had been competently planned. The soldiers process what just happened with a mixture of relief and rage. Relief that Spears saved them from complete disaster. Rage that Dyke's incompetence killed men who should have survived. The question nobody asks but everyone thinks: how did someone so obviously unqualified receive command of Easy Company? The answer involves bureaucracy, casualty replacement needs, and the institutional friction between combat reality and officer assignment systems. Good officers get killed. Incompetent ones sometimes survive long enough to receive commands they're not qualified for. The Dyke incident crystallizes a principle Easy Company learned across 2 years of combat. Rank doesn't equal competence, and sometimes survival means disobeying orders from officers who don't deserve to lead. It's the same lesson they learned during the Sobel Mutiny, except now the stakes are measured in immediate casualties rather than potential future risk. Winter's decision to relieve Dyke mid-battle violates every Army regulation about chain of command, but it saves lives. After the war, when interviewed about Foy, Winters never expresses regret about that decision. He saw men dying due to incompetent leadership and intervened. Military protocol can court-martial him for it, but the soldiers who survived because of it remain grateful. Ronald Spears becomes Easy Company's final commanding officer and leads them through the rest of the war. His reputation precedes him. Rumors circulate that he shot German prisoners on D-Day, that he killed his own sergeant for giving away their position, that he's basically a psychopath in uniform. The rumors are probably exaggerated, possibly fabricated, but they serve a purpose. German soldiers hear about Spears and become more likely to surrender. Easy Company soldiers follow him without question because he's demonstrably competent and utterly fearless. The sprint through Foy becomes emblematic of his leadership style: aggressive, visible, leading from the front rather than directing from the rear. Men follow Spears because he never asks them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. It's the opposite of Dyke's leadership, or lack thereof. The Foy assault's real cost isn't measured in the 6 killed and 14 wounded, but in the psychological damage to survivors. Watching friends die because of officer incompetence is different from casualties suffered in well-executed operations. At Brecourt Manor, men died completing a mission. At Foy, men died because their commander froze. That distinction matters enormously to the soldiers who survived. It breeds cynicism about the Army's ability to identify and promote competent leaders. It reinforces the lesson that soldiers must rely on each other and their NCOs, because the officer corps includes men who have no business commanding in combat. And it adds another layer of trauma to soldiers who've already endured too much. The knowledge that sometimes the greatest threat isn't the enemy, but your own leadership. January 9th, 1945. Ends with Foy secured, Dyke reassigned, Spears in command, Buck Compton evacuated, and Easy Company reduced by another 20 casualties. They're exhausted, depleted, and increasingly cynical about the Army's competence. But they've also demonstrated once again their ability to improvise, adapt, and survive incompetent leadership through the expertise of NCOs and the intervention of officers like Winters, who value effectiveness over protocol. Foy proves that Easy Company's real strength isn't in whatever commanding officer gets assigned to them. It's in the bonds between enlisted men, the competence of sergeants like Lipton, and the institutional memory of soldiers who've survived every catastrophe the war could throw at them. They're learning that survival means trusting the men beside you more than the officers above you. It's a cynical lesson, but combat is a cynical teacher. February 12, 1945. The German border. Morning. Easy Company crosses from Belgium into Germany, and the welcome mat disappears. The signs change from French to German. The civilians shift from waving to glaring. The liberated become the conquered, and the psychological shift is immediate and profound. In France, Belgium, and Holland, Easy Company were heroes, soldiers bringing freedom to people who'd endured years of Nazi occupation. In Germany, they are invaders, foreign soldiers trampling through the fatherland, and the hostile eyes watching from windows and doorways remind them that these people supported Hitler, voted for the regime, and enabled everything the war became. Dick Winters feels the change viscerally. Liberation felt righteous. Occupation feels complicated. They're fighting the same enemy, but now that enemy includes old men, women, and children who look at American soldiers with hatred instead of gratitude. The German winter landscape is apocalyptic in ways Belgium and France weren't. Cities are rubble. Allied bombing has reduced industrial centers to skeletal ruins, where buildings stand like broken teeth against gray skies. Refugees clog the roads, fleeing west ahead of Soviet advances from the east, carrying everything they own in bags and carts. Easy Company soldiers watch the human tide and feel conflicting emotions. These are civilians suffering, children crying from cold and hunger, old women collapsing from exhaustion. But there are also German civilians, the population that empowered Nazi ideology, and Easy Company has seen what that ideology produces. The sympathy is complicated, conditional, mixed with resentment at having to feel anything at all for the people whose nation started this war. March 1945 brings an encounter that crystallizes the moral complexity of fighting in Germany. Easy Company advances through a small town and takes fire from a building. They assault the position following standard protocols, suppressing fire, flanking maneuver, grenades through windows. When they clear the building, they discover the shooter was a boy, maybe 14 years old, wearing a Wehrmacht uniform that doesn't fit, clutching a rifle he barely knows how to operate. He's dead now, killed in the assault. And Easy Company soldiers stare at his body, trying to reconcile what they see with what they know about warfare. He's a child. He's also an enemy combatant who shot at them. Both things are true simultaneously, and the contradiction is impossible to resolve. The Hitler Youth encounters multiply as Germany's military situation deteriorates. The Wehrmacht is drafting teenagers and old men, throwing them into combat with minimal training because there's nobody else left. Easy Company engages 12, 13, 14-year-old soldiers who fight with fanatical desperation, or surrender immediately depending on their individual breaking points. The American soldiers hate these encounters. Shooting a trained German soldier is war. Shooting a child in a Wehrmacht uniform feels like murder, even when that child is trying to kill you. The NCOs try to take prisoners when possible, but sometimes circumstances don't allow it. Sometimes the child soldiers fight until killed. The psychological toll on Easy Company is immense and largely unspoken. The Ruhr Pocket operation in March demonstrates Germany's collapsing military structure. Easy Company participates in encircling German forces that have been bypassed during the Allied advance. Entire divisions trapped in a shrinking pocket with no hope of victory, fighting because surrender means Soviet captivity or because Nazi ideology won't permit the alternative. The fighting is chaotic and fragmented. Small unit engagements that lack the grand tactical clarity of Normandy or Bastogne. Easy Company assaults a position, German soldiers surrender or die, they move to the next position, repeat. The casualty count is relatively light, 8 killed, 19 wounded from February through April, but every death feels more tragic this close to war's end. Surviving Normandy and Bastogne only to die in the final months is a particularly cruel form of unlucky. April 12, 1945. News reaches the front lines that President Franklin Roosevelt has died. Easy Company soldiers, like Americans everywhere, process the shock of losing the only president many of them have ever known. Roosevelt was elected in 1932, before most Easy Company men were old enough to vote. The question circulates through the ranks. What happens now? Will the war continue? Will the new president, Harry Truman, barely known to most Americans, maintain the commitment to unconditional German surrender? The uncertainty adds psychological weight to an already exhausted force. They're fighting toward an end they can sense but not see, and leadership transitions at the highest levels create doubts about whether that end will arrive before they're killed. The point system becomes the obsession of every soldier as Germany's collapse accelerates. The Army has announced that discharge priority will be based on a points calculation: 1 point per month of service, 1 point per month overseas, 5 points per combat decoration, 12 points per Purple Heart. Soldiers need 85 points to qualify for immediate discharge rather than Pacific deployment. Easy Company veterans calculate obsessively. The Toccoa originals have high scores: 2 years of service, D-Day casualties earning Purple Hearts, combat decorations from Normandy and Bastogne. Most have 60 to 75 points. They need more decorations or more time to reach 85. The calculation creates a perverse incentive structure, wanting to survive but needing combat action to earn the points that guarantee they won't be sent to invade Japan. April 25, 1945. Easy Company enters Bavaria, the heart of Nazi ideology, birthplace of the party, and location of concentration camps that rumors have whispered about for months. The soldiers don't know what they're approaching. Intelligence hasn't briefed them on the camp system's full scope. They've heard stories, fragmentary reports from refugees, unconfirmed accounts of atrocities, pieces of a picture they haven't assembled yet. They know Germany has committed war crimes. They don't yet know the industrial scale of Nazi evil. That revelation waits ahead in the Bavarian countryside, in a place called Landsberg, where Easy Company will discover why they've been fighting this war, and what happens when ideology becomes genocidal policy. The German countryside in late April feels surreal, pastoral beauty scarred by war's debris. Forests are green with spring growth. Villages are destroyed by artillery. Civilians work fields while smoke rises from burning towns on the horizon. The Wehrmacht is disintegrating, soldiers surrendering in groups of dozens or hundreds, sometimes without firing a shot. The resistance comes from SS units and fanatical holdouts who believe in fighting to the death, even when strategic situation is hopeless. Easy Company engages these remnants in firefights that seem pointless. Both sides know Germany has lost, but some soldiers keep fighting anyway because surrender feels like betrayal, or because Nazi ideology demands martyrdom over pragmatism. The psychological state of Easy Company in April 1945 is complicated and fractured. They're veterans of nearly a year of continuous combat. They've survived Normandy, Market Garden, Bastogne, and the push into Germany. They've lost friends, killed enemies, endured conditions that would break normal soldiers. They're tired beyond exhaustion, operating on momentum and the knowledge that the end is close. But close isn't the same as finished. Men still die in the final weeks, killed by snipers, artillery, or bad luck at the exact moment when survival seems most likely. The proximity to war's end makes every casualty feel more tragic, more wasteful, more evidence that fate is cruel and random. They want it to be over. They're afraid to hope it will end before something kills them. What Easy Company doesn't know as they advance through Bavaria is that the worst thing they'll witness isn't combat. It's not the child soldiers or the refugee columns or the shattered cities. The worst thing is waiting in a camp near Landsberg, where the true nature of Nazi Germany will be revealed in forms more horrific than anything they've experienced in combat. They think they've seen war's worst brutality in the hedgerows of Normandy and frozen foxholes of Bastogne. They haven't. The death they've dealt and endured was warfare, terrible but comprehensible within military logic. What they're about to discover at Landsberg exists outside that logic, in a realm of deliberate, systematic evil that will redefine their understanding of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. The Reich is falling, and its fall is exposing the machinery of genocide that operated in its heart. April 27, 1945, Kaufering 4 labor camp, near Landsberg, Bavaria. Early afternoon. Easy Company approaches a complex of barbed wire and wooden barracks, and the smell hits them 50 yards before they see anything. It's a stench beyond description. Human waste, decay, death, disease concentrated and fermented. Soldiers gag, pull shirts over their noses, try not to vomit. Then they see the camp itself. Emaciated figures in striped rags move like ghosts between buildings. Bodies are stacked near the perimeter like cordwood, limbs protruding at angles that look wrong. The guards are gone, fled ahead of the American advance, leaving behind the evidence of what they've done. Easy Company soldiers stop at the wire, staring, unable to process what they're seeing. This isn't war. This is something else entirely. This is industrialized death, systematic starvation, genocide as bureaucratic policy. Dick Winters will later say that Landsberg was worse than any combat he experienced. The soldiers who survived Normandy and Bastogne agree. Nothing prepared them for this. Kaufering 4 is a subcamp of Dachau, part of a network of labor camps where prisoners were worked to death, building underground factories for German war production. When Easy Company arrives, approximately 3,000 prisoners remain, the survivors of a population that once numbered 8,000. The missing 5,000 died from starvation, disease, or execution. The survivors weigh 70 to 80 pounds on average, skeletons with skin stretched over them, eyes sunken deep in skulls, moving with the slow deliberation of people whose bodies are consuming themselves to stay alive. Many are too weak to stand. They lie in barracks on wooden bunks, 3 or 4 to a level, surrounded by the dead who haven't been removed yet. Typhus is epidemic. Dysentery has made the camp a biological hazard. The Americans liberating the camp are also exposing themselves to diseases that will kill some prisoners even after freedom arrives. The German civilians from the nearby town claim they didn't know. Easy Company soldiers force them to tour the camp at gunpoint, make them walk past the bodies, smell the stench, see what existed 3 miles from their homes. The civilians react with varying degrees of horror, denial, and feigned ignorance. Some cry, some vomit, some maintain blank expressions and insist they knew nothing about the camp's purpose. The American soldiers don't believe them, can't believe them. The camp is too large, operated for too long, required too much local infrastructure and labor to be unknown. But whether the civilians knew or chose not to know is a distinction that feels meaningless in the face of what Easy Company is witnessing. The bodies don't care whether German citizens were complicit or merely indifferent. Easy Company soldiers try to help with what resources they have. They distribute rations to prisoners, which creates an immediate problem. Starving people given food often eat too quickly, overwhelming digestive systems that have atrophied during starvation. Several prisoners die from refeeding syndrome, their bodies unable to process the calories American soldiers gave them, trying to help. The medics arrive and begin triage, separating those who might survive from those too far gone. It's a medical catastrophe requiring resources the frontline army units don't have. The seriously ill need hospitalization, nutrition therapy, antibiotics for the infections ravaging their systems. What they get are combat medics with field supplies trying to treat conditions they've never encountered in medical training. The psychological impact on Easy Company is profound and immediate. These are soldiers who've killed men in combat, watched friends die, endured conditions most civilians couldn't survive. But combat has logic. Soldiers fight, soldiers die. Both sides understand the rules even if they don't like them. Landsberg has no logic. These weren't combatants. They were civilians, primarily Jews, but also political prisoners, Roma, homosexuals, anyone the Nazi ideology deemed subhuman, systematically murdered through forced labor and starvation. The prisoners didn't fight. They couldn't fight. They were simply ground down through calculated brutality until they died or were too weak to work, at which point they were discarded. The Americans liberating the camp are confronting evil at a scale that defies comprehension. April 28, 1945. Medical teams arrive with better resources and take over care of the surviving prisoners. Easy Company soldiers are relieved of duty at the camp, returning to military operations as Germany's collapse accelerates. But they carry Landsberg with them. Several soldiers stop writing letters home entirely. They can't explain what they have seen, can't find words adequate to the horror, and don't want to burden families with knowledge of something so dark. Others write brief, cryptic references. We found a camp. It was bad. Can't talk about it. The disconnect between what they've witnessed and what they can communicate becomes an unbridgeable gap. Landsberg is incommunicable. It exists outside the vocabulary of normal human experience. Dick Winters processes Landsberg by trying to contextualize it within the war's broader meaning. They weren't just fighting to stop German territorial expansion or to defend Allied interests. They were fighting to stop this, to stop a regime capable of industrialized genocide, to end a system that could conceive and execute the systematic murder of millions. Landsberg retroactively justifies every sacrifice Easy Company made. The deaths at Normandy, Bastogne, Foy, all of them served the purpose of ending the Nazi state before it could kill more people in places like Kaufering 4. It's cold comfort for the families of the dead, but it's the meaning Winters extracts from the experience. The war had moral clarity after all. Not geopolitical clarity, but moral. This is what they were fighting against. The estimated death toll at the Kaufering complex, which included 11 subcamps near Landsberg, exceeds 14,500 people over 2 years of operation. Most died from starvation, disease, or exhaustion from forced labor. Some were executed outright when too sick to work. The camps were part of a project to build underground aircraft factories, using concentration camp labor to construct facilities that would be immune to Allied bombing. The prisoners worked until they died, were replaced by new prisoners, who worked until they died, in a cycle that treated human beings as expendable resources consumed in industrial production. The bureaucratic efficiency of the system, the careful record-keeping, the organized logistics, the systematic dehumanization, disturbs Easy Company soldiers as much as the death toll itself. Multiple Easy Company veterans, interviewed decades later, cite Landsberg as their most traumatic experience of the war. More than D-Day, more than Bastogne, more than watching friends die in combat. Landsberg represented something qualitatively different from warfare. It was genocide as policy, murder as bureaucracy, evil operating through forms and procedures rather than passion or battle frenzy. Combat trauma comes from fear, violence, and loss. Landsberg trauma comes from witnessing proof that human beings can create systems specifically designed to torture and kill other human beings en masse, and that entire societies can enable such systems through active participation or passive indifference. It's a different category of horror, one that undermines assumptions about human nature and civilization. April 29, 1945. Easy Company leaves the Landsberg area and continues advancing into Bavaria. They don't talk about the camp much among themselves. What is there to say? They saw it. They'll carry it forever. The images don't fade. The stacked bodies, the skeletal prisoners, the stench, the barracks full of dying people. Some soldiers develop nightmares that persist for years or decades. Others suppress the memories entirely, refusing to discuss Landsberg even with family. The psychological coping mechanisms vary, but the impact is universal. Every Easy Company soldier who witnessed Landsberg was changed by it. They returned to combat operations different men than they were before the camp, harder in some ways, more cynical about humanity's capacity for evil, but also more certain about the war's necessity. Whatever else was true about World War II, stopping Nazi Germany was unquestionably right. Landsberg proved it, May 5, 1945. Berchtesgaden, Bavaria. Early afternoon. Easy Company advances toward Adolf Hitler's mountain retreat complex, the Eagle's Nest, perched at 6,017 feet elevation in the Bavarian Alps. The symbolism is heavy and obvious. American paratroopers, many of them from working-class backgrounds, about to occupy the luxury compound of the man who started the war. The approach is anticlimactic. No desperate final defense by fanatical SS units. No booby traps protecting Hitler's sanctuary. Just abandoned buildings and spectacular mountain views. The Führer is already dead. Suicide in his Berlin bunker 5 days ago, and his regime is collapsing like a house with its foundation removed. Easy Company soldiers climb the mountain road, enter the compound, and experience the surreal disconnect of touring a dictator's vacation home, while Europe smolders in the wreckage of the war he created. The Eagle's Nest is obscene in its luxury. Hand-carved furniture, Italian marble, tapestries worth more than most Easy Company soldiers will earn in their lifetimes. A 400-foot elevator carved through solid rock to reach Hitler's mountaintop retreat. The soldiers walked through rooms where Hitler relaxed, planned military campaigns, and entertained Nazi leadership while millions died in concentration camps and on battlefields. The contrast between this opulence and Landsberg's horror, witnessed just days earlier, creates a rage that manifests as looting. Soldiers take everything not bolted down, silverware stamped with Nazi eagles, paintings, books from Hitler's library, china from the dining room. It's partly souvenir hunting, partly revenge, partly the simple human impulse to take something valuable from the people who caused so much destruction. May 8th, 1945, 11:01 at night. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is officially over. Easy Company, occupying Hitler's compound, celebrates with captured German champagne and cognac from the Eagle's Nest cellars. They get spectacularly drunk. They dance, sing, fire weapons into the air, and engage in the kind of release that comes from surviving something that should have killed them. But the celebration is complicated. They're drinking in Hitler's bedroom, while friends are buried in Normandy, Holland, and Belgium. They survived. Others didn't. The randomness of that outcome, who lived, who died, haunts the celebration even as they try to enjoy it. Some soldiers toast the dead, others drink until they pass out, trying to forget everything they have seen and done. The morning of May 9th brings hangovers and reckoning. The war is over, but what now? Easy Company receives orders for occupation duty in Austria, processing displaced persons and German soldiers trying to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. It's bureaucratic work, unglamorous and tedious after nearly a year of combat operations. The soldiers who survived Toccoa training, D-Day, Normandy, Market Garden, Bastogne, and the push into Germany are now glorified policemen, managing refugee camps and preventing violence in a collapsed society. The anticlimax is profound. They spent 2 years preparing to fight, and nearly a year fighting. Now, they're clerks with rifles, counting prisoners and filling out forms. The point system creates divisions within Easy Company that feel personal and painful. Soldiers with 85 points or more qualify for immediate discharge. They'll be processed out and sent home within weeks. Soldiers below the threshold face uncertainty, maybe occupation duty for months, maybe deployment to the Pacific for the planned invasion of Japan. The Toccoa originals mostly have enough points. The replacement soldiers who joined after Normandy don't. This creates a hierarchy of luck and resentment. The veterans are going home. The replacements are stuck in Europe or heading to another war. Friendships strain under the weight of disparate fates. Nobody chose their point total, but the randomness of who goes home and who stays feels cruel. The rumor of Pacific deployment dominates Easy Company's collective anxiety through May and June. The Army is planning Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945. Casualty estimates are catastrophic, predicting millions of Japanese deaths and hundreds of thousands of American casualties. The 82nd and 11th Airborne Divisions are slated for the operation. The 101st Airborne is on the standby list, meaning Easy Company might jump into Japan if the invasion needs additional forces. The soldiers process this possibility with grim fatalism. They survived Europe. Now they might die in the Pacific. The war doesn't end just because Germany surrendered. It just moves theaters. Occupation duty reveals the complexities of managing a collapsed state. Easy Company soldiers process thousands of displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, slave laborers freed from German factories, refugees fleeing Soviet advance, German civilians driven from eastern territories. The humanitarian catastrophe is overwhelming. People need food, medical care, shelter, and transportation to places that might not exist anymore. The Army establishes displaced persons camps, and Easy Company helps administer them, but the needs vastly exceed available resources. Soldiers watch people die from malnutrition and disease even after the war ends. Liberation doesn't equal survival. For many, freedom came too late. June through July 1945 brings gradual clarity about who's going home and who isn't. High Point soldiers begin processing out, leaving Easy Company in stages. The unit fragments as the Toccoa originals depart one by one, heading to ports for transport to the United States. The replacements remain, joined by new soldiers to maintain the company's numerical strength. But Easy Company, as the band of brothers forged at Toccoa, is dissolving. The men who jumped on D-Day, survived Bastogne, and climbed to the Eagle's Nest are scattering to civilian lives they haven't lived in years. The reunions and bonds they assume will last forever begin the slow process of decay that distance and time inevitably produce. August 6, 1945. News reaches Easy Company that the United States has dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The soldiers don't understand the technology. Few people outside the Manhattan Project do, but they understand the implications. A single bomb destroyed an entire city. If this weapon can end the war without an invasion, Easy Company won't deploy to the Pacific. The relief is immediate and overwhelming. 3 days later, August 9th, a second atomic bomb hits Nagasaki. Japan's surrender becomes inevitable. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announces surrender, and World War II finally, definitively ends. Easy Company soldiers who feared dying in Japanese jungles can now exhale. They survived. They're going home. The war that killed 60 million people globally is over. The Eagle's Nest occupation provides Easy Company with symbolic closure, but also exposes the uncomfortable reality of victory's spoils. They're living in luxury, stolen from a genocidal dictator while managing the human wreckage his regime created. They're celebrating survival while processing the scope of what the war cost: the dead, the traumatized, the broken societies, the moral compromises required to win. The narrative they've inhabited, heroic soldiers defeating evil, is true but incomplete. They also witnessed atrocities, killed enemy soldiers who were sometimes children, and participated in a war that reduced Europe to rubble and killed civilians by the millions. The complexity of that moral landscape doesn't fit neatly into the victory narrative, so mostly they don't talk about it. They drink Hitler's champagne, loot his compound, and wait for orders to go home. September 8th, 1945. Displaced Persons Camp, Austria. Morning. Sergeant Carwood Lipton supervises the distribution of breakfast rations to 300 refugees, former concentration camp prisoners, slave laborers, civilians who have been wandering Europe for months trying to reach homes that might not exist anymore. It's bureaucratic work, tedious and depressing, nothing like the combat leadership that earned him battlefield promotions. The war has been over for 4 months. Japan surrendered. Hitler is dead. Easy Company won. But winning doesn't mean going home. It means processing paperwork, guarding prisoners, and maintaining order in a society that's collapsed into chaos. Lipton has 89 points, enough to qualify for discharge, but the Army is processing soldiers slowly, prioritizing critical skills and unit, rotation schedules over individual eligibility. He might wait months before reaching a port, more months before boarding a ship, and he's one of the lucky ones. Soldiers with fewer points might remain in Europe until 1946. The paradox of occupation duty is that it's simultaneously boring and traumatic. No combat, so no immediate danger. But the work involves daily exposure to human suffering on scales that make combat seem clean by comparison. Easy Company soldiers staff displaced persons camps where tens of thousands of people wait for the Allied bureaucracy to figure out what to do with them. Many are concentration camp survivors who have nowhere to go. Their homes were destroyed, their families were murdered, their communities were erased. Others are ethnic Germans expelled from Poland and Czechoslovakia in waves of retaliatory violence that mirror Nazi atrocities. The soldiers trying to manage this humanitarian catastrophe are 22 years old, trained to kill people and break things, now expected to function as social workers, police, and administrators for a refugee crisis nobody prepared them to handle. Discipline deteriorates as purpose evaporates. During combat, soldiers followed orders because missions were clear and consequences were immediate. During occupation, the mission is maintain order, and the consequences are peacetime military justice that feels absurd after surviving Normandy and Bastogne. Drunk driving incidents increase. Unauthorized absences spike. Black market activity becomes endemic. Soldiers trading cigarettes and rations for watches, cameras, and other German goods. Officers try to maintain standards, but the enforcement feels performative. You can't threaten soldiers who survive D-Day with extra duty and expect them to care. The Army's peacetime regulations don't account for men who've lived through industrial-scale killing and emerged with a fundamentally altered relationship to authority and consequences. The point system creates a slow-motion dissolution of Easy Company's identity. High-point soldiers leave in stages throughout September and October. Dick Winters departs in early November, 80-plus points, plus his Distinguished Service Cross guarantee priority processing. The men who served under him throw an impromptu farewell party, toasting the officer who led them from D-Day through the war's end without seeking glory, demanding only competence and courage. Winters' departure symbolizes something larger than one officer's discharge. He was Easy Company's moral center, the leader they trusted unconditionally, the officer who proved through actions that competence and compassion could coexist with tactical brilliance. When he leaves, the company loses its gravitational core. October 1945 brings the surreal experience of soldiers celebrating peace while managing violence. The occupation zone includes Austrian and German populations that hate each other, displaced, persons seeking revenge against German civilians, black market gangs fighting over smuggling territories, and scattered Nazi holdouts who haven't accepted defeat. Easy Company soldiers break up fights, prevent mob violence, and occasionally exchange fire with die-hard SS members hiding in forests. It's not combat, nobody's using artillery or coordinating attacks, but it's not peace either. Men who thought the war ended in May realize it ended for them personally, but continues in diffused forms that are harder to identify and impossible to defeat through military force. The boredom becomes psychologically corrosive in ways combat never was. During battles, soldiers were too busy surviving to think about what they'd seen or done. During occupation, they have unlimited time to remember. Nightmares increase, drinking intensifies. Some soldiers develop the flat effect and emotional numbing that characterize trauma responses. The Army doesn't have a framework for addressing this. Psychiatry exists, but primarily to identify soldiers too broken to serve, not to treat the majority who are functional but damaged. The cultural expectation is that soldiers will simply adjust, that masculine toughness means suppressing emotion and moving forward. Most do. Some break. The ones who break are quietly discharged for nervous conditions and sent home to families who have no idea how to help them. November 30th, 1945. The last Easy Company veteran processes out of the Army and begins the journey home. The unit that formed at Toccoa in July 1942 officially ceases to exist. 141 men served in Easy Company at various points during the war. 48 were killed in action. 34% killed, which is below the airborne average but still devastating. 93 survived, many carrying wounds physical and psychological that will affect them for the rest of their lives. The Army will file the unit history in archives where it will sit largely forgotten for 45 years until a historian named Stephen Ambrose rediscovers it. But in November 1945, Easy Company's story is just one among thousands of military units being deactivated as the Army demobilizes from 12 million soldiers to peacetime levels. The journey home for discharged soldiers involves weeks of transit through military processing stations. Soldiers turn in equipment, receive medical examinations, complete paperwork documenting their service, and wait for transportation. The transatlantic crossing takes 7 to 14 days on overcrowded troop ships that hold thousands of soldiers returning from Europe. The ships dock at East Coast ports where military bands play, crowds cheer, and the nation celebrates its returning heroes. The soldiers disembark into a country that simultaneously lionizes and doesn't understand them. Americans want to honor veterans, but don't want to hear about Landsberg or Bastogne or what it actually felt like to kill another human being. The disconnect between celebration and comprehension will define veterans' relationships with civilian society for decades. December 1945 through January 1946. Easy Company veterans scatter across America, returning to hometowns and families they haven't seen in 2 or 3 years. The reunions are joyful and awkward. Parents cry, wives embrace husbands they barely know anymore. Children meet fathers who are strangers. The veterans discover that home has changed, or, more accurately, they've changed too much to fit back into the lives they left. Dick Winters returns to Pennsylvania and realizes he can't farm anymore. The work feels trivial after commanding soldiers in combat. Bill Guarnere goes home to Philadelphia missing a leg, rebuilding his life around disability and memories. The men who survived try to reintegrate into a civilian world that seems impossibly distant from everything they've experienced. The promises of the GI Bill offer lifelines for veterans seeking purpose after military service. The legislation provides education benefits, housing loans, and unemployment support specifically for veterans. 79% of Easy Company survivors use the education benefits, completing college degrees and entering professions that would have been economically impossible without the support. They become teachers, engineers, businessmen, police officers, productive citizens who contribute to the post-war American economic boom. But the financial support doesn't address the psychological wounds. You can't take classes to unsee Landsberg or unfeel Bastogne. The GI Bill rebuilds careers. It doesn't rebuild the men whose psyches were shattered by war. What Easy Company veterans don't do for decades is talk about the war with each other. They return to civilian life and bury the memories, focusing on jobs, marriages, children, and building the normal lives they fought to preserve. No reunions are organized, no letters circulate. The bonds forged in combat seem to dissolve in the acid of distance and time. Each veteran processes his trauma alone, in nightmares and silence, managing as best he can without support networks or therapeutic frameworks. They don't know that across the country, their fellow Easy Company soldiers are having identical nightmares, identical struggles with alcohol and rage and numbness. They're isolated from the only people who could understand. The longest wait isn't for discharge from the Army. It's the 45 years before they finally, hesitantly, painfully begin talking about what they survived and what it cost them. December 19th, 1945. New York Harbor. Morning. The troop ship carrying discharged Easy Company veterans glides past the Statue of Liberty, and soldiers crowd the railings to see her. Some cheer, some cry. Most just stare in silence, processing the symbolic return to an America they left 2 or 3 years ago. But that feels like a different lifetime. They're wearing the same uniform they wore at Toccoa, but they're not the same men. The boys who volunteered for paratrooper training died somewhere between Normandy and Bavaria. Not literally, but psychologically. The men coming home are harder, older than their years, carrying memories they can't share and wounds that don't show. The ship docks to brass bands and waving crowds, and the veterans descend the gangplank into a celebration that feels simultaneously deserved and alienating. America wants to honor them. America has no idea who they are anymore. The discharge process strips away military identity with bureaucratic efficiency. Turn in equipment, complete final medical examination, sign paperwork, acknowledging receipt of discharge pay and benefits information. Collect DD Form 214, the honorable discharge certificate that proves military service. The transformation from soldier to civilian happens in a processing station over several hours, and then the veterans walk out into American cities wearing civilian clothes purchased from base exchanges, carrying everything they own in duffel bags. Many feel naked without rifles. Most feel lost without orders. The Army provided structure, purpose, and clear objectives for years. Civilian life offers freedom without direction, choices without framework. It's paralyzing for men accustomed to following orders and executing missions. Family reunions reveal the unbridgeable gap between veterans' experience and civilian comprehension. Dick Winters' parents ask him about the war, and he offers sanitized summaries that communicate nothing meaningful. We jumped on D-Day, did some fighting in France, went to Belgium, ended up in Germany, came home. They nod and smile, satisfied with the answer, unaware that he's omitted Landsberg, Bastogne, watching Cowboy Hall bleed out, making life-and-death decisions at 26 years old. His family doesn't push for details. He doesn't volunteer them. The silence becomes the foundation of his post-war relationship with loved ones, polite, loving, but fundamentally separate from the truth of what he experienced. The nightmares start within weeks of returning home. Easy Company veterans wake screaming, reliving firefights and artillery bombardments. Some attack their wives in their sleep, reacting to dream enemies with violence that carries into the waking world. Others simply can't sleep, lying awake watching shadows and interpreting every sound as potential threat. The hypervigilance that kept them alive in combat persists in Pennsylvania bedrooms and California apartments where the only danger is memory. Families try to understand, but how do you comprehend someone jumping at car backfires or scanning every room for exits? The veterans recognize their behavior is irrational, but can't stop it. The survival instincts carved into their nervous systems by combat don't shut off just because the war ended. Employment presents challenges that the GI Bill can't fully address. Veterans enter a post-war economy booming with opportunity, but many find civilian work feels meaningless after military service. Buck Compton, recovered enough from his breakdown to return to civilian life, attends law school on GI Bill benefits and becomes a prosecutor. It's important work, serving justice, but does it compare to leading men in combat? Dick Winters tries farming, realizes it's impossible to care about crop yields after commanding Easy Company, and uses his benefits to attend business school. Bill Guarneri, missing a leg from Bastogne, works construction and raises a family in Philadelphia. The jobs pay bills and provide structure, but many veterans struggle with the sense that civilian life is inherently trivial compared to what they've survived. Early 1946 brings the painful realization that Easy Company's bonds are dissolving despite the intensity that created them. The men are scattered across the country: Pennsylvania, California, Oregon, Illinois, dozens of states. No central organization maintains contact information. No one takes responsibility for organizing reunions or circulating letters. The soldiers who swore eternal brotherhood in Normandy foxholes lose touch within months of discharge. They're busy building civilian lives, focused on jobs and families, trying to move forward rather than dwelling in the past. The isolation is particularly cruel for veterans struggling with trauma. The only people who could understand what they're experiencing are the fellow Easy Company soldiers they have lost contact with. They suffer alone, assuming their struggles are unique rather than universal among combat veterans. The cultural narrative of World War II as the good war creates pressure on veterans to conform to heroic archetypes they don't feel. Americans want to believe their soldiers were brave, noble, and unchanged by combat, patriots who served righteously and returned to seamlessly resume civilian lives. Easy Company veterans know the reality is messier. They were brave, yes, but also terrified. They served necessary purposes but also killed people, including children in Wehrmacht uniforms. They returned home carrying trauma they can't articulate and moral complexities that don't fit the celebratory narrative. The disconnect between how they're perceived and how they feel creates additional isolation. They can't be the heroes America wants because being human means being more complicated than heroic narratives allow. Some veterans adapt successfully, channeling wartime lessons into civilian achievements. Dick Winters builds a business career applying leadership principles learned in combat. Carwood Lipton works for a nuclear energy company, using organizational skills developed as a sergeant. Don Malarkey enters the insurance industry and raises 10 children. These men find meaning in civilian life, though they carry Normandy and Bastogne with them always. Others struggle more visibly: divorce, unemployment, alcoholism, the visible symptoms of invisible wounds. The majority fall somewhere in the middle, functional but scarred, building normal-looking lives while managing psychological damage they can't fully acknowledge or treat. The variation in outcomes seems random, another example of war's lottery determining who thrives and who merely survives. By late 1946, Easy Company exists only in individual memories and military archives. The men who served are civilians now, anonymous within the massive population of World War II veterans returning to American life. 16 million Americans served in the military during the war. Easy Company's 140 men are statistically insignificant, their story indistinguishable from thousands of other units that fought and suffered and disbanded. Nothing suggests their experience will be remembered or celebrated. No one is writing books or making films about Easy Company. The Toccoa originals are scattered, silent, focused on private struggles in ordinary towns across America. The band of brothers who changed the course of battles has dissolved into civilian life, and it seems their story will disappear with them into unmarked graves and forgotten memories. What the veterans don't know in 1946 is that their silence will last decades, but won't last forever. In middle age and old age, some will finally begin talking, hesitantly at first, then with the urgency of men facing mortality and wanting to preserve what they witnessed. A historian will find them and convince them their story matters. A mini-series will make them famous to a generation that wasn't born when they jumped on D-Day. But all of that is 45 years away. In 1946, Easy Company veterans are just men trying to sleep through the night without screaming, trying to find meaning in peacetime work, trying to be good husbands and fathers despite carrying wounds that don't heal. They're going home. But home, they're discovering, isn't a place you can return to after war. It's something you rebuild from pieces, knowing it will never be whole again, hoping it will be enough. April 12, 1988. Dick Winters' home, Pennsylvania. A historian named Stephen Ambrose sits across from a reluctant World War II veteran who spent 43 years not talking about the war. Winters agreed to this interview only because Ambrose is writing a book about D-Day, and the historian was persistent enough to track him down through military records. The conversation starts carefully, Ambrose asking basic questions about training and deployment, Winters giving careful answers that communicate facts without emotion. Then Ambrose asks about Brecourt Manor, and something shifts. Winters realizes this civilian actually understands tactics, appreciates what that assault represented, sees it as historically significant, rather than just another firefight. He starts talking more freely, mentioning other Easy Company soldiers, describing the bonds formed at Toccoa and tested in Normandy. Ambrose recognizes immediately that he's discovered something larger than one officer's story. He's found a complete unit narrative with dramatic arc, compelling characters, and profound historical significance. He asks if Winters can help locate other Easy Company veterans. Winters hasn't spoken to most of them in 40 years, but he says he'll try. The decades between 1945 and 1988 were defined by silence that felt like survival strategy. Easy Company veterans returned to civilian life and deliberately didn't talk about the war. Not with families, not with each other, not with anyone. A survey conducted later found 67% never discussed combat experiences with loved ones before the 1990s. The silence wasn't indifference, it was protection. How do you explain Landsberg to your wife? How do you describe Bastogne to your children? How do you make someone who wasn't there understand what it felt like to watch friends die or to kill a 14-year-old German soldier? The gap between experience and explanation felt unbridgeable. So, most veterans stopped trying. They buried the memories, focused on present obligations, and built lives around the assumption that what happened in Europe would stay in Europe. But silence doesn't equal forgetting. The veterans carried the war with them daily, in nightmares that persisted for decades, in hypervigilance that never fully shut off, in the emotional numbing that protected them from feeling too much about anything. Bill Guarnere raised a family in Philadelphia, while replaying Bastogne in his mind every winter when snow fell. Don Malarkey built a successful insurance career while carrying guilt about surviving when friends didn't. Buck Compton became a Los Angeles prosecutor, sending criminals to prison while managing the psychological breakdown he suffered at Foy. The men functioned successfully in civilian life while simultaneously living with trauma they couldn't acknowledge because the cultural framework didn't exist. PTSD wouldn't be formally recognized as a diagnosis until 1980, and even then, it was associated primarily with Vietnam veterans. World War II veterans were supposed to be the greatest generation, stoic, heroic, untroubled by their wartime service. The silence extended to relationships with fellow veterans. Most Easy Company soldiers lost touch completely after discharge. No reunions were organized, no newsletters circulated. The bonds forged in combat, so intense they seemed permanent, couldn't survive the dispersal of peacetime and the shared commitment to not dwelling in the past. A few maintained sporadic contact. Dick Winters exchanged occasional letters with Carwood Lipton. Some veterans who lived in the same regions saw each other rarely at sea. Veterans' organizations. But the majority simply drifted apart, each man isolated with his memories, assuming his struggles were unique rather than universal. They didn't know that across the country, their Easy Company brothers were fighting identical battles with alcohol, nightmares, and the sense that civilian life was fundamentally trivial compared to what they'd survived. Stephen Ambrose's research in 1988 through 1991 broke the dam. He tracked down Easy Company veterans through military records, personal references, and persistence that bordered on harassment. Many were reluctant. What was the point of dredging up memories they'd spent decades trying to suppress? But Ambrose had a gift for making men feel their stories mattered historically, that their experiences deserved to be preserved and honored. Slowly, veterans began talking, first to Ambrose, then to each other as he connected them. Dick Winters provided contact information for the men he'd stayed in touch with. They provided names of others. The network rebuilt itself through interviews and phone calls, creating connections that had been dormant for 40 years. The first official Easy Company reunion happened in 1992, 47 years after the war ended. 42 veterans attended, gathering in a hotel meeting room to see men they'd survived hell with but hadn't spoken to since 1945. The emotional intensity was overwhelming. These weren't young paratroopers anymore. They were men in their 70s, gray-haired or bald, carrying the weight of decades and diseases of aging. But when they saw each other, the decades collapsed. Bill Guarnere embraced Joe Toye, both men crippled by the same artillery barrage at Bastogne, both surviving against probability. Carwood Lipton shook hands with veterans he'd led as a sergeant. Dick Winters received the respect and affection of men who still considered him the finest officer they'd served under. The reunion was cathartic, painful, and necessary, a recognition that what they'd shared couldn't be erased by time or silence. The reunions became annual events through the 1990s and 2000s, attendance gradually declining as age and death thinned the ranks. The gatherings served purposes beyond nostalgia. They provided space for veterans to finally discuss experiences they'd suppressed for decades. Stories emerged that hadn't been told even to spouses, acts of courage, moments of terror, moral complexities that had haunted them for 50 years. The shared storytelling was therapeutic in ways individual counseling couldn't replicate. These men understood each other's nightmares because they'd lived identical ones. They could acknowledge fear without judgment because they had all been terrified. The reunions created permission to be honest about the war's cost, the psychological wounds, the guilt about surviving when friends died, the difficulty of reconciling who they'd been with who they'd become. Stephen Ambrose published Band of Brothers in 1992, and Easy Company's story entered public consciousness for the first time. The book became a bestseller, introducing millions of readers to men who'd lived anonymous civilian lives for 47 years. Veterans who'd never discussed their service suddenly found themselves recognized in restaurants and thanked by strangers. The attention was uncomfortable for men who'd spent decades avoiding the spotlight, but it also validated that their sacrifices mattered, that the suffering hadn't been meaningless. The book's success led to a phenomenon that would make Easy Company internationally famous. HBO optioned the rights for a miniseries that would premiere in 2001. The Band of Brothers miniseries transformed Easy Company from historical footnote to cultural phenomenon. 10 episodes, 13.5 million viewers on premiere night, critical acclaim, and awards that cemented it as one of the finest war productions in television history. The veterans watched themselves portrayed by actors, their experiences dramatized for audiences who had no direct connection to World War II. The response was complicated. Some appreciated the respectful treatment and historical accuracy. Others found it painful to watch. The Bastogne episodes in particular triggered trauma responses in veterans who had spent 50 years trying to forget frozen foxholes. But overall, the miniseries accomplished something the veterans couldn't do themselves. It made younger generations understand why Easy Company mattered and what they'd sacrificed. The public recognition that followed the miniseries was validating and exhausting. Easy Company veterans became celebrities in their 70s and 80s, invited to speak at schools and military events, signing autographs and posing for photographs with people young enough to be their great-grandchildren. The attention honored their service, but also reduced complex men to simplified characters from a TV show. They were the real Captain Winters, or the actual Bill Guarnere, their identities compressed into the roles they had played in their 20s. Some veterans embraced the platform, using visibility to educate about war's realities. Others retreated from publicity, uncomfortable with fame and the way their stories were being interpreted by people who hadn't experienced combat. The final years of Easy Company survivors were marked by increasing urgency to preserve memories before they disappeared forever. Veterans who had maintained silence for 5 decades suddenly felt compelled to document everything, participating in oral history projects, speaking to schools, writing memoirs. The motivation wasn't ego. It was responsibility to the men who didn't come home. 48 Easy Company soldiers died in combat. The survivors felt obligated to ensure those deaths weren't forgotten, that the generation coming of age, in the 21st century, understood the cost of stopping fascism. The stories poured out in the final years, specific details about firefights, names of friends killed, moments of terror and courage that had gone unspoken for 60 years. It was as if approaching death gave permission to finally, honestly confront what they'd survived and what it had taken from them. January 2nd, 2011. Dick Winters's funeral, Pennsylvania. Thousands attend services for Easy Company's legendary commander, dead at age 92 from Parkinson's disease. The mourners include surviving Easy Company veterans in their 80s and 90s, military officers representing multiple generations, and civilians who knew Winters only through books and television but felt compelled to honor him anyway. The funeral is quiet, dignified, exactly what Winters would have wanted. No speeches glorifying war, no hollow patriotism, just acknowledgement of a man who led with competence, integrity, and reluctance to claim credit for achievements he considered collective rather than individual. The Easy Company survivors form an honor guard, men who once followed Winters through Normandy and Bastogne, now struggling with canes and wheelchairs to pay final respects. They're saying goodbye not just to their commanding officer, but to the era he represented and the bonds he symbolized. Winters' death marks the beginning of the end, the moment when Easy Company's transition from living memory to history becomes undeniable. The mathematics of mortality are brutal and inevitable. Easy Company's veterans entered their 70s in the 1990s, their 80s in the 2000s, their 90s in the 2010s. Age brings disease, heart failure, cancer, strokes, the accumulated damage of decades that even the strongest bodies can't resist forever. The first Easy Company veteran died in 1946 from wounds sustained during the war. The last will die in 2022, 76 years after Toccoa, 78 years after D-Day. Between those endpoints, the roster of the living contracts with each passing year. Obituaries appear in local newspapers noting that a veteran died, usually including brief mention of World War II service without elaborating on Easy Company. The funerals are increasingly well attended, as Band of Brothers fame brings public recognition, but the core mourners are fellow veterans, fewer each year as the ranks thin toward zero. Donald Malarkey died in September 2017 at age 96, one of the last Toccoa originals, and a veteran whose post-war struggles with alcohol and PTSD were well documented. His obituary highlighted his insurance career and large family, 10 children, numerous grandchildren, but those who knew him understood that he never fully recovered from the war. He carried survivor's guilt for 6 decades, questioning why he lived when friends died, struggling with the randomness of combat, mortality. The Band of Brothers miniseries gave him platform to finally discuss experiences he'd suppressed, and the late-life recognition seemed to provide some peace. But peace isn't the same as healing. Malarkey died carrying Bastogne and Normandy with him, the trauma unresolved despite therapeutic storytelling and public honor. His death reduced Toccoa survivors to a handful. Bradford Freeman died in July 2022 at age 97, the last surviving Easy Company combat veteran. His death was widely reported, marking the historical transition from living memory to archived history. Freeman jumped on D-Day, fought through Normandy and Bastogne, witnessed Landsberg, and lived to see Easy Company become famous through books and television. In his final years, he participated in commemorations and interviews, serving as the last living link to the company's actual experience. His death means there are no more first-hand accounts, no more opportunities to ask questions of the men who were actually there. Easy Company's story is now entirely mediated through documents, recordings, and the memories of people who knew the veterans but didn't experience the war. The last formation has occurred. The ranks are empty. Dick Winter's death in 2011 was particularly symbolic because he represented Easy Company's conscience and best self. Other veterans might have been more decorated, killed more enemies, or suffered worse wounds, but Winters embodied the leadership ideal that defined the company's identity. He led without seeking glory, demanded competence without cruelty, and maintained humility despite extraordinary achievement. His post-war life reflected those principles. He avoided publicity when possible, deflected credit to the men he commanded, and resisted efforts to turn him into a living symbol of World War II heroism. When he died, Easy Company lost its gravitational center, the officer who proved that courage and compassion could coexist, that you could kill efficiently in war without becoming someone who glorified killing. The legacy Easy Company leaves exists on multiple levels: military, cultural, and moral. Militarily, the Brecourt Manor assault remains taught at West Point as an example of small unit tactics executed with near-perfect precision under extreme conditions. Dick Winter's fire and maneuver approach became doctrine, studied by officers who will never fight wars resembling World War II, but can still learn from principles demonstrated in Norman hedgerows. The tactical lessons are preserved in training manuals and officer education curricula, ensuring that Easy Company's methods survive, even as the men who develop them die. The military legacy is concrete, measurable, and ongoing. Students at service academies still learn Dick Winter's name in leadership classes. Culturally, Band of Brothers embedded Easy Company into American collective memory in ways most World War II units never achieved. The miniseries has been watched by hundreds of millions globally, introducing audiences who have no living connection to World War II to the realities of airborne combat. The episodes are referenced in popular culture, analyzed in classrooms, and rewatched by successive generations, discovering them through streaming platforms. Easy Company became synonymous with World War II airborne excellence, their story representing the broader narrative of American soldiers in Europe. The cultural impact extends beyond entertainment. The series sparked renewed interest in World War II history, drove tourism to battlefields and museums, and created demand for first-hand veteran accounts before those voices disappeared. Easy Company's cultural legacy is preservation of memory in forms accessible to people born decades after the war ended. The moral legacy is most complex and most important. Easy Company's story demonstrates that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when united by purpose and tested by extreme circumstances. The men who trained at Toccoa were working-class kids with minimal education, no special talents, and no inherent heroism. They became elitist soldiers through brutal training, combat experience, and the bonds formed through shared suffering. The lesson isn't that war creates heroes. It's that ordinary humans contain capacities for courage, endurance, and sacrifice that emerge only when circumstances demand them. Easy Company proves that heroism isn't exceptional. It's ordinary people responding to extraordinary situations. But Easy Company's legacy also includes the costs that heroic narratives often ignore. 48 men killed, dozens more wounded physically, every survivor carrying psychological trauma that affected families and futures. The Band of Brothers' celebration of their achievement risks romanticizing war in ways the veterans themselves resisted. In their final interviews, Easy Company survivors consistently emphasized that they weren't heroes seeking glory. They were soldiers doing jobs, trying to survive, serving necessary purposes without enjoying the violence required. They wanted to be remembered, yes, but not celebrated in ways that might make war seem appealing to future generations. Their legacy includes the warning, "We did this so you wouldn't have to. Learn from it, honor it, but don't glorify it." The final messages from Easy Company veterans were remarkably consistent across different individuals and decades. They emphasized brotherhood, that the bonds formed in combat were the most meaningful relationships of their lives, more profound than marriages or family ties because they were forged in circumstances where trust meant survival. They acknowledged luck, that survival was often random, that being a good soldier didn't guarantee coming home, that fate determined outcomes as much as skill. They honored the dead, repeatedly insisting that the real heroes were the men who didn't come home, that survivors had an obligation to remember friends killed in France, Belgium, and Germany, and they warned against romanticizing war, that it was necessary in their case to stop fascism, but that combat was horror, not adventure, trauma, not glory, something to be avoided if possible, and endured only when essential. The question of what Easy Company accomplished extends beyond tactical victories and strategic contributions. They helped defeat Nazi Germany, participated in liberating concentration camps, and served in the military effort that saved European civilization from fascism. Those achievements are historically measurable and morally unambiguous, but their deeper accomplishment might be demonstrating a model of leadership, teamwork, and sacrifice that remains relevant long after the specific war they fought has faded into history. Easy Company showed that effective organizations require trust between leaders and led, that competence matters more than rank, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things through training and mutual commitment. These lessons apply to military units, corporations, families, and any human organization facing challenges that exceed individual capacity. As the last Easy Company veterans died through the 2010s and early 2020s, they left behind an archival record unprecedented for a single military company: oral histories, memoirs, filmed interviews, the extensive research behind Band of Brothers, and decades of documentation by historians and filmmakers. Future generations wanting to understand what combat felt like for American paratroopers in World War II will find Easy Company's experience exceptionally well preserved. The veterans' willingness to finally discuss their experiences, painful as it was, created a historical resource that wouldn't exist if they had maintained the silence of earlier decades. Their legacy includes the gift of preserved memory, the decision to document rather than suppress, the choice to educate despite discomfort. The last formation of Easy Company occurred not at a funeral or memorial, but in the gradual disappearance of living memory as the final veterans died. When Bradford Freeman passed in July 2022,